Dude, part five, the last episode, the last installment.
I hope you're ready for this roller coaster. We're in the home stretch.
Dude, you look, I've had to deal with this for a little while now, so I'm going to do this to everyone else out there. You're going to want to listen to this really closely because there's some stuff here that's going to kind of blow your mind a little bit as we wrap this up. So this ought to be good stuff. So Michael, as we ended last episode, we kind of ended with those resignation letters that were
Yep,
really
yep, yep.
prepared for Taylor and Matthias Cowley, and it was done in my opinion in a really dirty way because it was like, look, this is just in case things get bad, right? This is
Yeah.
like
Mhm.
break in case of fire, and
Yep,
just like
absolutely.
6 months later, they're like, oh, the fire's here. Sorry, you guys got to go, but don't worry, we'll bring you right back in. And that's kind
Well,
of where we left off at there with that.
yeah, they held on to those resignation letters for 6 months. They were prepared in October of 1905 and they were released in April conference 1906, which we're going to get to in a minute. So we know they're already there. It's been left up to Reed Smoot's discretion whether to use them or not. But we also went over how Reed Smoot started to get telegrams and letters from Joseph F. Smith through George Reynolds or George F. Gibbs, who were secretaries to the first presidency, saying, "The Lord will bless you if you don't sacrifice these brethren." Right. Um, anyway, we're gonna get into that in just a second, real quick. I wanted to go over three characters' names real quick that will appear just for a refresher, so you understand. So we understand what their positions were in the church. There was Joseph W. Summerhays, who was a general board member of the YMMA, and he took his fifth wife as a post-manifesto wife, and he was a traveling companion of Joseph F. Smith during this time period. And during the last episode, we covered how Joseph Summerhays traveled with Joseph F. Smith and Matthias F. Cowley, and I think John W. Taylor, up to Canada. Then they went down to the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming, where Matthias Cowley performed a plural sealing for the stake president, Byron Sessions. And then they went down to Mexico traveling together, and Joseph F. Smith gave Summerhays a charge to perform a plural marriage for a Bishop Sears. Another character that will appear a lot in this episode and has been around in the others is Joseph M. Tanner, who is the general superintendent of church schools, and he took his first plural wife post manifesto. No, I don't think it was his first plural wife, but he took his first post manifesto plural wife in 1901. And Henry S. Tanner. So you have Joseph M. Tanner and Henry S. Tanner. They are probably related. I don't know that for a fact. They don't seem to be super near relations. I just want to lay that out so that they're not confused. So Joseph M. Tanner is a general superintendent of church schools. Um, his, I believe, his sister married, or Nathan Clark's sister. He married Nathan Clark's sister, so that's important. I believe later, or during this time period. And Henry S. Tanner was a local 70s president. He was a judge, and he takes his second and third wife in 1901. He was I found out today the former mission president of California before Joseph E. Robinson, who we've discussed at length, was the mission president of California. Who he was setting up Roger Clausen, right? Remember that
Mm-hmm.
with the hotel rooms with his
Yep.
post second manifesto wife. Um, Henry S. Tanner also served another mission for the church after he was released as mission president in the northern states mission, and he had two wives sealed to him by Matthias Cowley up to this point.
Nice.
Okay, so that's what I wanted to cover there. Now moving back into the narrative, so into the new year, 1906, the bad news. Apostle Mariner W. Merrill dies on February 6th, 1906. Um, some information on Mariner Merrill to have the last word on him because he'll no longer really appear in this narrative. I discovered the reason, I think, I believe, why he was so adamant about his position on maintaining celestial plural marriage despite the manifestos. He was born in Canada, a non-member. Um, he joined the church in 1853 and when missionaries came and taught him, and then he moved to Utah. He became a bishop up by Cache Valley, and then he became the temple president of the Logan Temple before he was ordained a member of the Quorum of the 12. But the reason he joined the church was because when he was a young boy, he had a vision where he saw himself and other members of his family living plural marriage.
As a
And
young
that was
man?
completely as a boy, young boy, or a teenager, maybe younger than
Wow.
that, but and so he went and asked his mom, mother, why don't we live polygamy like the patriarchs in the Bible? And she didn't have an answer for him, and he just kind of kept it under his hat. What I read earlier about that is he was told not to reveal more about what he knew about that from what he was shown in his vision.
Oh,
But
wow.
he asked that question to his mom, why don't we live plural marriage like they do in the Bible? And so he knew by a revelation from God that that principle was holy. And so when he was taught by the elders as a young man, he joined the church because he found these people that were living this way that God had showed him as a young man or young boy. And so he was all for it, and just he knew that was where he needed to be, and he moved to Utah. So I could see with that development in his youth why he would be a diehard for the principle.
Oh, yeah, because that's a direct revelation, and that's one of those things that was a recognizable trait, right? And we could see why, if the Lord was, quote, after him, so to speak, that would be a dead giveaway. There weren't too many other Christian sects of the time, you know, promulgating plural marriage by any stretch. The other thing that I wonder about is his mom must have thought, "What are you talking about, son?" I mean, this is
Yeah.
Victorian America, right? So when you're 12 or 13-year-old runs up and like, "Why aren't we doing this multiple wives thing?" That must have like freaked her out a little bit, I would imagine.
I wish I would have done the family history on this, but um, I am descended through like a brother or a cousin of his.
Okay,
And so that is like, I'm not church royalty, but that's like the closest I
sure,
am to church, leadership in my own family is
sure.
through Brother Merrill. Um, in any case, that's fun. And so it makes sense why he would be one of those to write in his journal after the first manifesto. I do not believe the manifesto to be a revelation from God because he had it on authority from God himself that was the principle to live.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as
And,
we covered earlier, he was the first apostle to perform a plural marriage in Utah after the first manifesto as well.
nice. Nice. Well, you could see why it would be near and dear to his heart, right? And in some
Sure.
ways, watching this come to pass, the manifesto and stuff, that must have been hugely disconcerting for him, right? Because
Oh, sure.
this
Yeah, he
that was
went as
the
far
entry
as to
that was the entry point.
he refused to play ball with any of the politics afterwards either. Like when people were being called into the stand and asked what the scope of it was, and they were kind of being very political and even lying. He's like, no, absolutely not. I'm not going to be involved with that.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yeah, no, I get it. Doesn't make me feel so alone. That's how I ended up joining fundamentalism was at first. So at least,
No, anyways, I just like to shout out and thank you to Brother Merrill
yeah.
for all of his diligent hard work up to that point. Um, moving on, we get into the Judson Tolman marriages. So we know now that Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor have signed their resignation letters. But on February 14th, 8 days after Brother Merrill dies, stake patriarch of Davis Stake, Judson A. Tolman, who is age 79 at this point, marries his fifth wife in Bountiful, Davis County, Utah, at the residence of another stake patriarch named Samuel Bryson by Ward Bishop of West Bountiful Ward, Dan Muir. Super interesting.
Mueller.
Dan Muir had Muir, Muir.
Oh, okay.
Dan Muir has a brother named Leo J. Muir, who many years later, when Rulon Allred was getting involved with the fundamentalists and was pursuing a testimony of the principle, and struggling with that and trying to get his wife to come along, and I don't know if you know this, but Rulon Allred separated from his first wife because she would not follow
Right.
him down that road. In any case, she reported him to their state president in California, who was Leo J. Muir, who was, the brother to this guy that married Judson Tolman to his fifth wife. And brother Leo Muir pretty much gave it, pretty scathing, instructions, and even publicly was like, we are not entering into plural marriage anymore, and all this. And he told Rulon Allred that you're going to be excommunicated if you follow this route, and all of that, and basically highly discouraged him. And then Rulon Allred, and this is according to Rulon Allred's, you can find this in Treasures of Knowledge, him telling the story. He then tells President Muir, I have a testimony of this, and God revealed it to me. And it's at that point that Leo J. Muir says, God bless you, Brother Allred. I hope that he'll protect you.
Holy cow. Yeah. I mean, the kind of going from one extreme to another on this, where you got to keep the public face, right? So you got to really give it to them. And then you almost have whiplash when they turn around and be like, okay, you're willing to go through the fire for this. God bless you. And off you go.
Yeah, so it's like it's like the test, and the AUB does this with converts. Is they'll give you the cold shoulder when you express any interest, and they want you to knock down their door over and over and over again before they pretty much allow you to have any progress investigating. It's kind of that test thing, to see, are you truly committed? And obviously brother Leo J. Muir had knowledge of what was going on, at least in his brother's life previous decades earlier, which we're covering now, right? And so when he saw that Rulon Allred had a testimony, the facade dropped.
Right.
In any case, that's a fun little story.
This is something that I've seen that's kind of overarching through this time period in history, but I still think it's the test today, right? Where if you're coming out of the church, you are very much like Adam and Eve, right? You have essentially been given two commandments that can't be obeyed simultaneously, right? Sure. One is, follow the prophet at all costs. And then the other is, to live this principle or get okay with this principle, which requires you to be like, okay, so which one is it? It's very much the same kind of test that Adam and Eve faced in the garden.
I think so as well. So back to Brother Tolman. About 4 years after all this, he, because he gets exposed and he's eventually excommunicated. When he's being interviewed by the 12, they ask him, did any member of the 12 or First Presidency give you authority to do this thing, meaning the marriages that he's going to be involved with? And he said, no, sir. Now, that's fascinating to me because we're going to go over the evidence, I think, that points to the fact that Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor set him apart to do that. Because he's not lying by saying no, sir, because they were not members of the Quorum of the 12.
Right.
At this point.
Right.
So they ask him.
Go ahead. Finish your thought.
I was just going to reiterate.
Who was Joseph F. Smith still prophet at this time?
Yep, absolutely.
Part of it could be, and this is something else to keep in mind as well here, right? Is that this is a time period within the church now. I think we've entered that point to where the house is divided against itself.
Yeah, it is.
And so
it very much is.
In some ways, I wonder if by him answering that, he's trying to protect the president of the church. He's trying to protect members of the 12, right? I mean, this is
Well, there's
where it's really cloak and dagger at this point. I think even
it
within
is, and
the church.
there's circumstantial evidence that he was protecting John W. Taylor and Joseph F. Smith, and especially Joseph F. Smith, and because there's circumstantial evidence that Joseph F. Smith was involved and protected other men that he helped, that Tolman officiated for, and we're going to cover that. But yeah, him answering no, sir, to that question is, pretty interesting, because we know that Judson Tolman was 5 years previous to this at the meetings that John W. Taylor was having, which were David W. Jeffs called patriarchal meetings. And Judson Tolman told him in 1901, told David W. Jeffs, you will enter into the principle of plural marriage.
Wow.
Prophesying to him, right? So we have that connection. John W. Taylor had a home in that stake. Judson Tolman was going to those meetings. He's now performing these plural marriages in that stake where John W. Taylor has a house and was living for years. Anyway, we'll come back to that. February 21st, 1906 is when Joseph W. Summerhays goes down to Mexico to marry, to basically fulfill the commission that he got from Joseph F. Smith to marry a second wife to William G. Sears. According to D. Michael Quinn, President Joseph F. Smith was pretty upset that Summerhays delayed the ceremony from the time that they took the trip together till this point that he actually officiated. The reason that Summerhays delayed was because she had not yet received her endowments. And I guess under the circumstances, Joseph F. Smith's opinion would be that it was more expedient to get married than to make sure that it was done in the order that it's normally ideal in.
That brings up a question I want to ask you.
Sure.
Throughout history, and I'm not talking just this time period, but maybe even going back to Joseph Smith's time period, was it always customary that a woman takes out her endowments first before she gets sealed? Or was there some flexibility there in that?
I mean, Joseph Smith definitely was having those marriages done for himself before they were administering endowments.
Okay.
To everyone. There was the Holy Order, and there was people who, and like the apostles and those in the inner circle, them and their wives started to get their endowments like the last year of Joseph's life. But we know he was teaching polygamy the last 3 years.
Right.
And so, yeah, that was happening before. And even on the plains westward and on the way to winter quarters into Utah, plural marriages were being solemnized to people who had not received their endowments yet.
Okay. All right. I just find that interesting because I think a lot of us are raised with the LDS customs, right? And I've seen it within fundamentalism, and it made me go back and look, and I couldn't find it anywhere either where it was ever said it has to be in this order. It doesn't seem.
I personally think it's more ideal to have your endowment first.
Sure.
But I know a fundamentalist leader who told me specifically his thoughts were that you should not have your endowment until you enter into the principle.
Interesting.
That was his take on it.
Interesting. Okay. Interesting. I tend to be somewhat libertarian, so to speak, on this, where I'm like, look, this is probably not a one-size-fits-all answer as far as the order of things, right? And circumstances have to play a part in that.
I agree. I completely agree. So yeah, so Joseph W. Summerhays performs that sealing down in Mexico. This was brought up to the Quorum of the 12 when they started investigating new plural marriages a few years later. And basically, Joseph F. Smith went to bat for Joseph W. Summerhays and Bishop Sears, and they were exonerated. They were never excommunicated. Neither of them were ever excommunicated. That was in 1910. And on the heels of that, around 1912, President Smith, this is according to D. Michael Quinn, President Smith told Joseph E. Robinson whom he had allowed to begin a polygamous courtship in September of 1907, quote, "It is hard to make some people see the difference between cases that you will permit this one, but won't or can't that." Or, yeah, but that one, yeah. So it's interesting. So, yeah, Joseph F. Smith went to bat for them and got them off the hook. He was not able to do that in every case. Um,
Let me ask you this. Who are the ones that are really pushing for the excommunications?
Well, that's where it gets tricky because in 1909, which is what would have brought up these things, Joseph F. Smith authorized Francis M. Lyman and another apostle or two, I think James E. Talmage was one of them, to start investigating new plural marriages and to start excommunicating members of the church who were doing that.
And this is happening at the same time period where Joseph F. Smith is okaying some of these.
Right. And so President Smith tells Robinson, it's hard to make some people see the difference between this case or that case, how it can be allowed this case or can't be allowed or won't be allowed or encouraged in this case, in another case. We're going to get down later down the road. There's a journal entry from Joseph Robinson as well, where he says that President Joseph F. Smith and Anthony H. London and I understand each other.
Okay.
So it's like Joseph F. Smith was telling some people one thing, like these guys, Summer Hayes, Robinson, the Tanners, Joseph Musser, they're getting encouraged, but when the threat to the public face of the church is there, he tells the official arm of the church, being led by the quorums of the church and their presidents like Francis M. Lyman, yeah, go take care of this. They're breaking the rules of the church. And I can see why, because he'd kind of have to be forced to acknowledge it, otherwise it would look suspicious, And so one historian noted that Joseph F. Smith was actually responsible for dividing the church against itself because he had two distinctly opposite motives. One was to preserve the legal entity and the physical state of the church, and the other goal was to perpetuate plural marriage no matter what. And at this point in time, those two things could not be reconciled. But he basically, those who wanted to fall into the camp of preserving the church no matter what, he told them, do whatever you need to do to preserve the church no matter what. And to those preserving plural marriage, he said, preserve plural marriage no matter what. That's what it looks like.
Ooh. Wow. Now let me ask you this question. During this time period, is Joseph F. Smith signing off on every one of these plural marriages? Because we know, per our one of our last conversations, we know that he compartmentalizes this, right? He makes sure
That's what it looks like.
He makes sure that in this case, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, so to speak, for plausible deniability. So is he privy to every one of the marriages that John W. Taylor is performing, that Matthias Calloway is performing? Does he look at them and say, okay, they're more mature within the quorum and they have discernment good enough to tell if this is going to be good or bad or whatever?
So I will comment on that by remarking, do you remember John Taylor's stance in the 1880s when he was subpoenaed into court to testify?
Yeah.
And he basically says, I have studiously avoided knowing these things. And I don't know if that was exactly Joseph F. Smith's stance. It would definitely not be accurate to say that he knew of all of these indications, especially because you have people entering into solemn covenants without another officiator going on, like Don Moroni LeBaron and others who were doing it that way. And maybe he knew about those, maybe he didn't, maybe he encouraged that. John W. Taylor later, and we're getting ahead of ourselves, but he said to the Quorum of the 12 when he was on trial that he had never married anyone without the permission of President Smith.
Okay.
Now, D. Michael Quinn, if I recall in his work on this, says that might not have been entirely accurate, but I would say it's at least mostly accurate. in most cases, John W. Taylor was making sure he was working with full, in full report with Joseph F. Um, in any case, we know that Joseph E. Robinson and Joseph Summerhays were involved with Joseph F. Smith, apart from, but also kind of intertwined with Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor. Following these events, April 6th, 1906, Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor's resignation letters were read at General Conference. John W. Taylor tells one of his wives, quote, "I was sacrificed for Reed Smoot's personal ambition."
Only to have that guy later thrust the United States into the Depression.
Yeah. Now, I would like to read some journal entries from some prominent people in the church to know how they felt about this
Hang tight real
resignation.
quick. Do we, when they resigned from the church, do we have those letters?
Yes, I believe they are in the copies that I know of. I think are published in Drew Bryany's book Apostles on Trial, I believe.
And what was the tone of those letters? I mean, was it like, we screwed up, we're out, or is it like, we are resigning for reasons unknown, or
I
we
don't recall Matthias Cowley's per se, but there was some element in John W. Taylor's resignation letter that said, "We have been found out of harmony for our understandings of the application of the manifesto, not applying to countries outside the United States," and basically apologizing for putting the church in that position.
okay,
You know, it wasn't fully apologizing, but basically it was political. It was a little political
a lot political.
maneuvering.
Yeah,
Yeah. But yeah, basically saying, yeah, we were involved in this, and it was because we didn't understand the intention of the leaders in the church and the scope of the manifesto.
gotcha. Okay.
In any case, J. Golden Kimball writes on April 8th, 1906, Apostles John W. Taylor and Matthias F. Cowley resigned from the apostleship. It is a political move to protect the Church of Latter-day Saints, as the church is on trial before Congress. Brother Taylor and Cowley are rams caught in the thicket and are offered as a sacrifice. So
Wow.
he knows. He knows
Yeah.
what's up. Orson F. Whitney writes on April 9th, 1906, Brother George F. Richards succeeds the late Apostle Mariner Wood Merrill. I am put in the place of John W. Taylor, resigned, and Brother David O. McKay in place of Matthias F. Cowley, resigned. 19 years ago this coming summer, Apostle John W. Taylor predicted to me that I would be an apostle. We were traveling together south and were on a train opposite of Murray. I little dreamed, nor did he, that I would succeed him in the quorum. He was always very good to me.
You know, it's one thing to see a prophecy come to fulfillment. That always brings joy. But this one, you get the feeling that there's a somber tone to it, right? That
Yeah.
I didn't think it would go this way.
Oh, no, yeah, absolutely not. And we know that Orson F. Whitney had taken at least one post-manifesto wife um, during this time period, and he was always sympathetic to the people who were getting called on the carpet, that I know of, like Joseph Musser, for example. When that happens coming up, um, remembering, what we discussed with Joseph Musser is he said that David O. McKay and Orson F. Whitney and Roger Clausen were very good to me,
Right.
Um, on April 10th, 1906, Joseph E. Robinson told in a meeting with 8 of the apostles and several mission presidents, he told them, quote, President Taylor died in exile for this principle, and he gave men authority to perform the ceremony of marriage, which authority, I have been told, was never revoked.
Hmm. It really
So
does.
what does that sound like?
What's that?
Well, what does that sound like?
Sounds like a guy who's fully committed to the principle.
And he's relating something that sounds very similar to the 1886 story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I kind of took that for granted, but absolutely. just the amount of division now that we're starting to see within the church is fascinating. And I think it's playing out again, to be honest with you, right? I think there's still some, different issue, but I think we can look at certain members of the first presidency, certain members of the 12, although they're getting few in number now, who really have issue with, the trans movement, the LGBTQ movement, and you get the feeling that much. I just find um the the parallels from then to today, even though it's different issues, striking, very
It is. It is. Yeah. If, for example, I believe Holland is pretty strong on the traditional stance. If he dies before he becomes president of the church, I think it's game over.
You're more hopeful than
If he becomes president of the church, we may see some conservative reforms. Very much like when President Nelson took over, we've seen liberal reforms since Monson.
right.
Um, that would be my prediction in any case. Um, the 8 apostles who were in that meeting that Joseph E. Robinson said and disclosed that John Taylor had set apart men to perpetuate plural marriage, which was never revoked. They were Francis M. Lyman, John Henry Smith, Roger Clausen, Hiram Mack Smith, George Albert Smith, Charles W. Penrose, and George F. Richards and Orson F. Whitney. And so you have a pretty evenly mixed pro and against mixed. Yeah, it's a mixed audience for that kind of information for sure.
Man, I can't imagine what those meetings must have looked like, right? How, yeah, wow. I mean, if they're that evenly divided, whew.
Well, on the heels of that, just a few days later, actually 2 weeks later, 2 weeks after Joseph E. Robinson tells those guys that authority has been perpetuated, and knowing that John W. Taylor, and Matthias Cowley have just resigned, Orson F. Whitney records in his diary um, that he and Roger Clausen, at his suggestion, were up in the historian's office, and we sat for half an hour or more talking of Brother John W. Taylor and Matthias F. Cowley, etc. So they're talking about what's going on.
Ooh.
And we know that both Roger Clausen and Orson F. Whitney are sympathetic or completely cooperative with new polygamy.
Gosh, I would love to get inside the mind of a couple of those guys, right? Because the old crap meter must be going off pretty heavily, right? You just saw two of the stalwarts being asked to resign, right? And it's probably becoming clear now that that thing that was told to them that, hey, we're going to bring you right back in, isn't happening. And so now you're watching this go down, and all of a sudden the quorum is evenly split.
Yeah.
Joseph F. Smith is being duplicitous, and I get that, right? I get what he's trying to do there. At the same time, the writing's on the wall at this point, right? Anybody can see it now.
And we can read into this conversation, like what else are they talking about besides their own polygamy and the topic of polygamy, because both of them are violators of the law.
Yeah.
And they've entered into and of the rule of the church, which was that no plural marriages were going on in the church.
Oh, jeez. And yeah, I mean, they got to be worried about them, their families. I mean,
Yep. Yeah. John and Matthias just got cut off. Maybe we're next, maybe
right.
That's what they're talking about.
Yeah, I would imagine, right? It has to be on their mind. I mean, it would have been different had, and this is where I lean towards, there was a takeover at some point in the church, right? Hardcore takeover. A couple things that we talked about in the last episode that got me was the Quorum of the 12 has a meeting without the first presidency where this has come to pass. It just smacks of a couple of apostles who I think hatched a plan, knew what they had to do, and then just got it done, right? And the writing's on the wall now. It's not like they replaced John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley with other strong supporters of new polygamy. They made
No,
sure they went
the
the
only one
other
being
direction.
Orson F. Whitney being the exception, maybe, but not likely that they knew that. But fundamentalist tradition states that Francis M. Lyman and other leaders of the church were at one point trying to basically find out whether or not Joseph F. Smith was encouraging this new polygamy. And if they found the evidence for it, they were going to impeach him as president of the church according to Section 107, which you can do. And then they were going to have him locked up in jail.
Holy crap. Oh, that is a bold move. And again, I call it a takeover because it's going in the exact opposite direction that had been established since the first manifesto, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now all of a sudden, and I'll just call it like I see it, a couple guys made a deal with the devil, so to speak, and they found themselves in positions of power. And I'm sorry, but the set of cojones on that guy to be like, okay, next in our sight is Joseph F. Smith if we can come up with the ammo. I mean, that takes some serious intestinal fortitude to go that
Yep,
direction. Can you imagine the
that's true.
crisis that would have happened had they got that done?
Oh, dude. Oh, man.
I
Oh,
mean, here's the thing, right? And I'm glad that they didn't get that done because, dude, that had the the ability to entirely wreck Mormonism, right?
it may have, but on the other hand, we wouldn't have the dogma of prophetic infallibility in the church because it would be on the history that we disfellowshipped or removed a president of the church from office.
That's a good point too, right? In the other direction, I just can't imagine the fallout from impeaching a sitting church president. That would have been catastrophic.
It would have been absolutely. On June 14th, 1906, Patriarch Judson Tolman marries his sixth wife. The marriage is also solemnized and performed by Bishop Dan Muir of the West Bountiful Ward at another stake patriarch's house, Israel Barlow Jr.,
Mm,
at his house in Bountiful. On the same day, Dan Muir married his second wife, Georgina Barlow, which was Patriarch Israel Barlow Jr.'s niece.
okay.
And they were sealed together by Judson Tolman.
All right.
So they're doing some cooperative efforts.
Right.
Okay, moving on. Um, According to D. Michael Quinn, on June 23rd, 1906, according to the diary of Mission President Joseph E. Robinson, recently released apostle Matthias F. Cowley made the first earliest verified distribution of a copy of the 1886 Revelation given to President John Taylor on the New and Everlasting Covenant. So that's a fun one. So what happens with that story? Because John W. Taylor comments on that later during his trial. So Joseph Robinson writes in his journal that something regarding Matthias Cowley distributing the copy of the Revelation. What happened was Joseph E. Robinson, hearing from other people that the authority had been passed on, like we discussed, and he went and told the 12, and some mission presidents that the authority has been perpetuated. He's now trying to find the source material. And he goes and asks Matthias Cowley about it. And Matthias Cowley then refers him to John W. Taylor's brother-in-law, Rodney Badger. And Rodney Badger had the original, the original Revelation
Yeah.
in his possession at that point in time, and he made a copy of for Brother Robinson.
Is there any indication that that revelation was ever circulated throughout the church?
It's like Quinn is saying, the earliest verification that it's being distributed now underground widely is we're in June of 1906, and so but look at the writing on the walls here. Taylor and Cowley have just been cut off, and that's they've now allegedly, I'm alleging that they authorized Pullman to do his work because he's starting to do this. John Woolley's about to start as well, and so the pieces fit that even though that they got cut off from the 12, they actually still, and in church writings they were referred to as apostles still, even though they were outside the quorum of the 12. So it's really interesting in a priesthood fashion, you have two apostles, which we know can operate outside the quorum of the 12 because they're not the first ones. Um, you had Daniel H. Wells, who led the Nauvoo Legion during the Utah War against Johnson's army. He was never a quorum of the 12 member. Brigham Young ordained three of his sons apostles, two of which never became members of the quorum of the 12. Brigham Jr., the third, was not originally made a member of the quorum of the 12, but later was added when there was a vacancy. And Joseph F. Smith himself was ordained an apostle secretly outside the membership of the quorum of the 12, and was also added in later when there was a vacancy. Okay. And so this thing is not without precedent. But now, legally speaking, holding the virtue of their apostleship, they still holding that virtue, are not technically bound by the orders of conferring with their quorum because they don't belong to a quorum.
So in some ways, they've been set free, right?
In some ways, they've been set free, and that's the way I look at this.
Right.
And so they're still magnifying their duties to build up the kingdom of God by making sure a holy principle does not diminish or die from off the earth. And this is the way that they're doing it, is by distributing the 1886 revelation.
Okay.
As well as helping people find the right channels to people that have got this authority, like Tolman, Woolley, or what have you, whoever else.
So would you call this maybe the first major schism that we're seeing with authority now from the church?
I think this is the beginning of it. Yeah, absolutely. And, especially when we look at the characters, so in this case, if we break this down, Cowley is recommending to Joseph E. Robinson, who is in the personal inner circle with Joseph F. Smith, to go to John W. Taylor's brother-in-law to get a copy of the Revelation. We also know that John W. Taylor was holding meetings with Judson Tolman. So these things all connect to John W. Taylor in some way, form, or fashion. And It's going to get more intricate, by the way, as we get on, because there are more connections just like that. And I will point those out as we get to it. Also, July, the next month after, Robinson gets a copy of the 1886 Revelation, John Woolley in the East Bountiful Ward gives a talk wherein he says he thought that there was a great responsibility placed upon his shoulders and prayed to God to bless all. Quinn writes, aside from his alleged ordination in September of 1886, he might have been thinking of the patriarchal blessing that Joseph Smith Sr. gave to him when he was 8 years old on March 19th, 1840, quote, thou wilt receive keys and words of knowledge and power, and thou will be called the Lord's anointed.
Wow.
In addition to that meeting, I do really think that John Woolley was also in connection with Judson Tolman and John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley, and had this responsibility placed upon his shoulders, which is what he's remarking on. Because this is right on the heels of, it's 2 months after Cowley and Taylor just got cut off, and now he's saying, I have a great responsibility placed on my shoulders. 2 months after they have been shown to resign, he's admitting that or saying that.
Yeah, so in some ways, it's insinuating Taylor's going to work now. There's no more, the dog's off the chain, so to speak, and can do what he needs to do.
Yep. Further evidence to that is Quinn states that in August 6th, 1906, John W. Taylor encourages and provides for one of his friends in Canada to marry polygamously. So the month after that, he's still helping people. A month after that, September 2nd, 1906, Judson Tolman marries a stake presidency counselor named James A. Eldridge. He was Reed Smoot's brother-in-law. Anyways, Judson Tolman marries him to his second wife. Um, Joseph F. Smith also in 1911, 5 years down the road, also dissuaded the apostles from punishing Eldridge, and he was allowed to remain in his position as a counselor to a stake presidency until 1915.
Wow.
So he was off the hook even after Tolman gets excommunicated and they start finding out about all the marriages that he performs. This guy was left completely unharmed.
It makes me wonder what Joseph F. Smith's criteria was, right? And
Sure.
I think some of it, and correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I think some of it might be, can you keep your mouth shut, right? Can you not cause the church undue harm?
Sure. I'm sure that was part of it.
Can you
Absolutely.
be low key enough to not do this?
Yeah, absolutely. And as we've remarked, and once we're on the other side, what we should definitely do an interview with Joseph F. Smith too, because I always want to know what he's thinking too at some of these instances.
Oh yeah.
Not that I don't understand already, but I would just like to hear it from him. Anyways, getting into 1907, this is when John W. Taylor so he's removed from all leadership positions in the church. Um, that gives him a lot more freedom. Um, he ends up moving all of his families together in Provo. He for his entire life up to this point, he's had one wife in this city, one wife in this country, and he moves all of his wives to Provo, Utah, with the help of Nathan Clark, who was his neighbor in Farmington, and because of the lack of responsibilities, he's able to bring his family into harmony. And there's no more fear of being found out, of hiding. It's all out in the open, right? At this point. And so this is the environment that Samuel Woolley Taylor was born into. And he writes about his own life, saying that, and he was born in 1907. That's that first year that they moved down there. He said, "In my early years, we were all one big family. All my siblings were siblings. There was nothing half about it."
You can't help but think that in some ways, even though he was cut off from the church, that this in some way was a reward,
That's
right?
exactly what I was going to get to.
That this is a time at which John W. Taylor has has fought the fight for so long to to preserve this principle, yet keep everything on the down low, and now he can just be with his family.
Yeah, and he was not immune to the strife that came with the jealousies or the insecurities that his wives felt about the other wives. And there was years where Nettie Woolley Taylor never talked to the first two wives. Years. And now everyone's there, and Samuel, one of Nettie's youngest, remarks that, and you have an entire generation or a crop of the older kids that are now in adulthood from his first two wives or even from his third wife, young adults anyways, who lived in separation, but now the younger kids are all family. They're all siblings.
Okay, I'm gonna get up on my soapbox here for a minute, so you're gonna have to bear with me on this.
You're just fine.
Okay, first, to those out there struggling right now, and I know you're out there, where you're living a life where you have a couple of wives and you're trying to hold this on the down low. Just stop. Just stop. You've done enough. It's time for you to come out. It's time for you to just be able to be you. We live in a time now where everything goes on the left. You want to marry a mop, that's on the table. So it's we should have equal representation, and it's exhausting.
Absolutely.
I've done the whole hiding thing. It is horribly exhausting. Next, I know of a situation where the kids did not even know who their dad was. thought this was just a guy who would come over every so often and spend the night. Enough. Enough. I don't want to hear one more damn word about being scared. Part of this podcast is to kick down the door so this crap never has to happen ever again. Kick it down, get out of the shadows, because only bad crap happens in the shadows. And live your life, period. If you're letting fear dictate what you do, you're in a sad state of affairs. I get it. We owe a debt to our progenitors who, and I shouldn't even say a lot of people's progenitors who kept this alive, who were worried about their children and did have to hide out of necessity. But those days are over. If you're on the up and up and there's no abuse, you have no issues. No issues. And it's time to put this to bed because we're doing damage to families and it's just time to come out. And I can testify to this. There is no better feeling in all the world than just being free to do you, to live according to your principles or the principles God has given you, and just say to the hell with everybody else. It is absolutely liberating, and it's time we get there as a people. Pay homage to to the ancestors who came before us to keep this alive in the shadows. But we owe it to them now in a weird way to start getting more vocal than we've ever done before. I'm done. You can continue. I apologize.
No, I love it. I love it. And I wholly agree. The same year, 1907, John W. Taylor tried to persuade future church apostle Hugh B. Brown to marry two wives at the same time after he got off his mission.
Attaboy. Way to get after it. Wow, look at him.
Unfortunately, he didn't. And it's an interesting thing to consider that, I mean, Hugh B. Brown was from Canada, and John W. Taylor had a lot of things going on in Canada for a long time. But we see later on that even Hugh B. Brown's father was a polygamy advocate, Post-Manifesto. And he's hanging out. His name was Homer Brown, and he was a patriarch in Granite Stake, I believe.
It's so interesting how they set up these certain stakes to be safe havens.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Homer Brown is traveling in the 1920s with Matthias Cowley, and they're doing things like administering to the sick,
Right.
to children who are in these underground families, you know, and which, you know, Matthias Cowley was not allowed to use as priesthood according to the verdict of the trial he attended in 1911. So I'm happy that he was ignoring that. Because, and I'll just remark here, Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor were tried for their membership or their fellowship by the Quorum of the 12, which technically speaking is illegal.
Right.
It should have gone to a high council.
Yep.
And so you could make the argument, according to the laws of the church, that the verdict and outcome of those trials was illegal and null.
Right. Right. Well, I also find it interesting that nowhere in the Doctrine and Covenants where it deals with this sort of thing that we ever see anything where, quote, somebody's priesthood is revoked by another man, right? What we come up with is that the Lord is saying amen to the power of that priesthood if you're in transgression.
Yep.
And so this idea of priesthood only existing within the confines of a branch of Mormonism, I just don't think hold water, right? Now, certainly that branch has carte blanche to either recognize or not recognize that authority. But to me, from what I can see in scripture, the Lord is the only one that can revoke it, so to speak.
Sure, absolutely. And I concur with you. Unfortunately, despite his father's sponsorship of new polygamy, Hugh B. Brown, when he was later a member of the first presidency, helped write the law in 1935, making plural marriage a felony in Utah instead of a misdemeanor, which was worse than it ever had been back in the 1880s and up to 1935. Very sad. That same year, 1907, is when first presidency secretary and president of the 70, George Reynolds, performs a plural marriage, more than likely under the direction of Joseph F. Smith or another member of the first presidency. I would guess Anthony H. Lund. I don't know that for a fact. I don't have that information. But if you recall from last episode, he was the one in the Reed Smoot hearing saying, "I helped write the manifesto,"
Right.
and now he's performing a plural marriage. Um, February 21st, 1907, Carl Badger, who is a secretary to Senator Reed Smoot, writes a letter to his wife saying, "I must confess that the situation is beyond me. Reed Smoot has just said that he intends to tell the brethren when he gets home that if they want to continue this polygamy business, they must leave the United States. I asked if he meant unlawful cohabitation, and he said no. Well, I am dumbfounded that there should be the least suggestion of the possibility of the church attempting to establish polygamy, that it should be thought of for a moment. The senator also says that if John W. Taylor and Matthias F. Cowley are brought back and placed in the quorum of the apostles, nothing will save us from the wrath of the American people. I cannot entertain the thought that such a thing is possible. To think of it as being possible is to make the church out a hypocritical fraud. But here is the senator talking about the calamity as though it were a possibility."
This might be, that time in which I know from speaking to certain bishops and stake presidents, there's a lot of pressure put on those guys to preserve, quote, the good name of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And this might be really its first iteration in modern day, so to speak, where it's all about the perception, right? And if we don't have the right perception, we're going to be in trouble.
Yep. I never gave too much of a care for that, but I do understand it. 21st of February, 1907, we have a recorded instance of another polygamy advocate who was a patriarch named Harrison Sperry. And he would go around giving patriarchal blessings to children who were in these underground families because they have no access to patriarchs in the church, legally speaking, right? It's not gonna. Some of these people who are not being born, or they're, as we know from Anthony H. Lund and Joseph Musser, the parents are keeping the records, but they're not on the records of the church.
Right.
And so this man, God bless him, was doing a very great work in providing patriarchal blessings for the family members in those situations.
Just think about how crazy this time is, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you have families living on the underground, and it takes somebody who's moved by the Lord to feel sympathy towards them, and then goes and has to administer blessings on the down low. Their whole world must have seemed upside down.
Oh sure. Oh sure. Do you know who Harrison Sperry is, or who is? Or have you ever heard of Sidney B. Sperry?
No.
Oh, so this Harrison Sperry doing this great work here is the father of Sidney B. Sperry, who was basically like the first Hugh Nibley.
Okay.
He died in, I want to say, like 1967 or something like that. He got his bachelor's degree in chemistry in the 1800s still, and then uh, he ends up teaching at BYU, and then he gets a doctorate from the University of Chicago in ancient languages and biblical studies and stuff like that. And he becomes basically, he's famous in the church for his Old Testament biblical scholarship.
Oh, wow.
So basically, yeah, like I said, the first Hugh Nibley. Um, Lots of cool. I've seen some cool stuff from him. It's been a while since I've looked into that. Hugh Nibley had nothing but praise for Sidney B. Sperry, and even to this day, I believe BYU holds a yearly historical symposium named after him.
I was going to say the Sperry Symposium, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And so this is his father that's doing this underground polygamy work.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. And any idea how his son felt about any of this stuff?
No idea. I'd love to know if he was in the know on that, but I don't. That's a future research for another day.
Okay.
Also in this year, Joseph Musser marries his third wife uh, under the sealing authority of Patriarch Judson Tolman, and the marriage is performed at Joseph Musser's house.
Interesting.
Um,
Now,
apparently,
I have one more quick question. I'm sorry, I keep doing this to you. Um,
sure.
Taylor, I think it was 2 episodes ago now. Taylor seems to go out of his way to say, okay, who can still get this done? And for some reason, he feels prompted to go to patriarchs.
Yeah, it's an
Any
interesting thing.
any idea why patriarchs and not somebody else? Why not find certain state presidents or something like that?
Well, it looks like Joseph F. Smith did a little bit about that too. I mean, you have Frank Y. Taylor and John M. Cannon, who were in the members of the Granite Stake presidency. There was Heber Hale, who was the president of Boise State. But as far as the patriarchs go, I couldn't tell you that I know for sure, but I have two guesses.
Okay.
Um, Joseph F. Smith, one, being extremely sympathetic to the position of church patriarch because he's the son and grandson of the first two
Right.
um, to
Hiram
the
and
church, you know,
Joseph.
Hiram and Joseph Sr. Um, and his brother, John Smith, was the patriarch at this point. And then his son ends up, or his grandson ends up being the next patriarch of the church, also during Joseph F. Smith's life. Joseph F. Smith also made a remark in one conference that technically speaking, the office of patriarch to the church is above president of the church. And he said, we're not going to have a reformation over this right now, but that's my understanding, essentially, is that the office of patriarch is actually ahead of president of the church, which is just really interesting on several levels. Um, Also, according to section 124, in where it's declared through revelation from the Lord to Joseph Smith Jr., that Hiram should step forward and receive the mantle of prophet, seer, and revelator. It basically says, I give unto you, Joseph, Hiram Smith, to be patriarch unto you and to exercise the sealing keys over my church. And so, was there some extrapolation that, according to section 124, section 124, verse 124, that the office of patriarchs held sealing keys? It could be that there was some extrapolation. Later on, we have a lot of denials from church leaders saying, no, that's not what that means. But I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I'm hesitant to endorse those remarks for obvious reasons.
Right. Interesting.
But I sent you that text from Heber J. Grant, you know, that message from the first presidency in 1921, where he just says, we've had to cut off all these patriarchs in the church for thinking they have a right to perform plural marriage. Well, why did they think they had the right?
Right. Right. And this goes to, and this is why I find what Drew Briney is doing, shout out to Drew Briney, with the Doctrine and Covenants, right? With his annotated version of the Doctrine and Covenants.
Oh,
Because
yeah, sure.
not only will you be able to see the text, but you're going to see what the common understanding was amongst people for that time, right? And I tend to think you're that far back in history, you're that much closer to the font, so to speak, that springs forth in Joseph Smith, that what they think isn't conceived in a vacuum, right? They're obviously getting these ideas, most likely from Joseph himself or other high-ranking early leaders, and it goes to show that even though the word stays the same, the meanings have a way of changing.
So I will note on this topic of the patriarch office that after Joseph Smith started having the quorum of the 12 sustained in church conferences as prophets, seers, and revelators, he had his brother Hiram. I don't know about his father, but Hiram was, when the authorities of the church were presented in order from president, patriarch was next after president before the Quorum of the 12. That was continued down the line, even when Brigham Young was president of the church. That when John Smith, Joseph Smith Sr.'s brother, was placed as patriarch to the church after Hiram died, he was sustained as an authority in the church over the Quorum of the 12 after the first presidency. That changed after Uncle John Smith died, and John Smith, son of Hiram Smith, became president, patriarch of the church, but not immediately. There were some personality issues between Brigham Young and John Smith, and after enough years had passed, they decided to stop emphasizing that office during that time period. But as soon as Joseph F. Smith was back, was himself in office, he changed it back, and he started having his brother, John Smith, who Brigham Young de-emphasized, brought back into that same sustaining order, and even in meetings had the chair. He would have his brother meet with the Quorum of the 12 jointly with the first presidency in those meetings, and his brother would sit next to him in prominence.
Wow.
And so Joseph F. Smith very, very much so believed that there was a certain dignity, at least, for that office that is not talked about in the church today.
No, and if I'm not mistaken, the church since what was his name? I can't think what his last name was now. They've basically done away with that office entirely now. Patriarch of the church.
They got rid of it in 1978.
Yep. And I know the guy died in the early 2000s, and they just never.
He didn't. He died in 2013. He was over 100 years old.
Wow. I thought it was the early 2000s.
And he is the Eldred G. Smith, and he is.
Thank you.
He is the longest running general authority, person to have office as a general authority in the church. If you count all of those years, even after he was retired, because he kept his status as emeritus. Is that how you say that?
Emeritus, yeah.
Emeritus, yeah, emeritus. He had the emeritus status, but it's still technically general authority. So he was the longest running general authority in church history.
Ooh. Wow. And to me, that took fortitude to just say, yeah, we're going to do away with this office and not put it back.
That was Kimball.
Yep.
That was Spencer Woolley Kimball.
One of the things I've often wondered is if the patriarchs weren't a good outlet, because certainly while there's those above them, they don't really report to anybody outside the Quorum of the 12, right? And to me,
if even that, I don't even know if they were doing that at any given point.
Right. And so they kind of have a blank check, so to speak, that's been signed to them, and it wouldn't look out of place to go to somebody's home to give a blessing and get stuff done, right? And so it was probably one of those things that it just made sense, as well as you were alluding to in 121. There seems to be something there with sealing keys being given to patriarchs.
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's definitely, if it wasn't believed by those who were consulting with these patriarchs that there was already authority inherent in the office, it was definitely being applied to them, maybe by virtue of that verse that we discussed. It says that they can hold sealing keys, so might as well just reconfer it on them,
The other thing fascinating about 121 is that you have essentially simultaneously two presidents of the church operating at the same time. Joseph and Hiram both. Kind of throws a monkey wrench into the whole one-man thing.
Yeah, yes, it does. So yeah, so we're back at with Joseph Musser. He's entering these into this work with Judson Tolman, and likely was recommended by Matthias Cowley. Later on, when Tolman's excommunicated, he told the 12 that those marriages that he performed, the marriages he performed, were done upon recommendations from either Cowley, Henry S. Tanner, or Nathan Clark. Um, I personally believe, I theorize or hypothesize that really the recommendations that Judson Tolman was getting through Nathan Clark were from John W. Taylor. That's
Mm,
my theory. I, and so it's another layer of protection,
right,
you know.
right. Boy,
Um,
that's gotta really irritate those six apostles who thought, okay, we're done with John W. Taylor, but he's just out there doing his thing.
yeah,
I
and he's
mean,
working through these channels that they're. I mean, you already see this network that's forming. You got Henry S. Tanner, Cowley, Clark, Robinson, Rodney Badger, and it's gonna widen here. But yeah, we got Sperry, Brown, um, John M. Cannon, Joseph Musser is brought into this now. This is where he gets brought into it, as
right,
this movement that's this proto fundamentalist movement. It's not just um, that first marriage that he had from was endorsed by the Quorum of the 12 quite highly. We had John Henry Smith and Roger Clausen, and Matthias Cowley when he was in fellowship saying, yes, we'll help you live this law. But now it's even more on the fringe
right.
than ever before. Um, he gets caught though, and this is so interesting to me. In July of 1907, Salt Lake Tribune writes, Joseph W. Musser is the chief clerk and assistant secretary of the Utah Light and Railway Company. His father is assistant historian and political mouthpiece of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He himself is a high ecclesiast in the church because he was serving on the High Council in Granite State. Um, though about though but about 40 years of age, he is high counselor, of Granite Stake, and as such passes on the difference between the saints of his stake and the decisions are final, save that an appeal may be taken to the first presidency. The president of Granite Stake, Frank Y. Taylor, and his second counselor, John M. Cannon, are publicly known to have recently contracted plural marriages. So have the Sunday school superintendent and others of this stake. In fact, Granite Stake is a hotbed of new polygamy, and Forestdale, which is where which is a part of the stake, is oftentimes spoken of as Polygamyville, inasmuch as it is a refuge of those who are violating the laws by living their religion. Also, at this point, John W. Taylor had a house in Forestdale.
Nice,
Yeah, in
nice.
Granite. So that comes out, and so put a pin in that idea. So it's publicized. It's just been published that Joseph Musser just taken another wife. And we're going to come back to that probably pretty soon. September 1st, 1907, Anthony Ivins writes, John W. Taylor came to my office, had been in connection with Bishop Bentley and Matthias F. Cowley, accused me of connecting him with the Bishop Robinson case, said I wanted to make capital with the present quorum of apostles by going to President Joseph F. Smith with the story, would soon be vacancies to fill the quorum of the 12 apostles. In the evening, met with Bentley, Wilson, Taylor, and Cowley. So interesting stuff going on, but a Bishop Robinson, not Joseph E. Robinson, Samuel John Robinson, who I don't recall if they're related. He took a plural wife in Mexico. He's a bishop down in Colonia Dublon. And the 12 at this point are now deliberating and meeting together to know whether they should cut off Samuel Robinson from the church. And so John W. Taylor comes into Anthony Ivan's office to talk about it, basically to convince him not to do it.
Right, right. And this is a big step too, because I think this is the first time from the way you and I have talked that they're now talking about disciplinary actions outside of the United States.
Right. Yep. Heber J. Grant, this is interesting too, right? Heber J. Grant writes in his journal, December 4th, 1907, attended a regular meeting of the General Board of the YMMIA. After this meeting, had a talk of nearly 2 hours with Rudger Clawson on the status of John W. Taylor and Matthias F. Cowley. My heart goes out in sympathy to these brethren. So he's not fully turned against them at this point.
He just seems to be so all over the map. Grant does. Just you can't get a good beat on him.
No, not quite. Following that, George Albert Smith is down in Mexico and has a priesthood meeting down there to reorganize the bishopric. And so I don't know. I don't think Samuel Robinson gets cut off from the church, but he is removed from his office as bishop. And
Okay.
they get rid of him down there. Um, why did I put that there? I didn't put a date, but also getting into not Jan, the new year, 1908. Patriarch Judson Tolman marries Israel Barlow III to Alice Belva Welling at Henry S. Tanner's office. So we know that two marriages have been performed at Israel Barlow Jr.'s house 2 years previous to this. He is now marrying Israel Barlow's son, to his second wife. Israel Barlow III is a brother to John Y. Barlow, and Ianthus Barlow, and Edmund Barlow, I think, who become prominent fundamentalist leaders down the road.
Gotcha.
7 out of the 18 marriages that Tolman performs before he gets cut off from the church are done at Henry S. Tanner's office. The first marriage, so sometime during 1908, before he marries Israel Barlow III, he performs a sealing for Alpha J. Higgs, and marries 2 wives to Tanner himself in his office. So Henry S. Tanner's gotten 2 wives through the help of Matthias Cowley and 2 wives through the help of Judson Tolman. Alpha J. Higgs marries Rodney Badger's daughter. Do you remember who Rodney Badger is?
Refresh my memory.
Rodney Badger is a brother-in-law to John W. Taylor.
Okay.
Rodney Badger married John W. Taylor's sister. Alpha J. Higgs marries not John W. Taylor's niece, but a daughter of Rodney's from a different wife,
Okay.
not Taylor's sister. But you can't help but see that maybe Alpha J. Higgs and Rodney Badger were connected by John W. Taylor in that
Yeah.
instance, near family relationship, and is sent to Judson Tolman. And as Judson Tolman told the 12, I never performed a sealing, but for anyone that was not recommended to me by Matthias Cowley, Nathan Clark, or Henry S. Tanner. So it all fits really well. And Henry S. Tanner and John W. Taylor I think the writing is on the wall that they were friends. Later on, we are going to see some pretty strong remarks in favor of Tanner by Taylor, I believe.
It almost
Yeah,
feels like now Taylor is beginning to take on kind of a new mantle, right? He seems to be for lack of a better term, I'm not saying this was official or anything else, but he really seems to be the first fundamentalist leader now that has emerged. He's outside he's not completely outside the church. He's outside the quorum, right? I don't think he's been X'd yet, but he's orchestrating things behind the scenes now.
He's orchestrating things behind the scenes, but when things really leader, I might not say, but he could have been. And I guess for all intents and purposes, he is leading the charge. Fast forward March 2nd, 1909. This is when David W. Jeffs, also a brother-in-law to John W. Taylor because he married Nettie Woolley's sister Phoebe. He marries his second and third wife, which was performed by Judson Tolman. He marries his second wife, Nettie Lenora Timpson, and they were married in Salt Lake City. And David W. Jeffs writes in his reminiscences of his life that he was introduced to Tolman through John W. Woolley, which is interesting. Although that was probably before they were all attending those patriarchal meetings in 1901 together. So Judson Tolman prophesied 8 years before this point that Jeffs would enter into plural marriage. It's taken 8 years, but he has now taken 2 additional wives. Quinn writes that the meeting was arranged between Matthias F. Cowley and John W. Woolley, that Brother Judson come to the home of Brother Cowley, where Brother Jeffs was married to his wives.
Man, and now you start seeing names that are prominent in fundamentalism really begin to crop up.
Yes, right? We do. Yep. Maybe I should read some of this. But yeah, so yeah, in David W. Jeffs' journal, he writes, "My wife, Phoebe, came to me one evening at Iona, Idaho in 1906 and told me she had been shown that I should enter into this law of plural marriage, and that she had been impressed who it should be, even Lenora Timpson. This all came to me impressively as my mind had been engaged in so many church duties and also so much business responsibilities that I had not been considering nor thinking about complying with the law, which will increase the possibilities of entering into the highest degree of glory in the celestial kingdom of God. Notwithstanding the fact that Brother Jonathan D. Wood, the second counselor in the bishopric of Farmington, upon one occasion in the year 1900, before I left for Idaho, in shaking my hand, said, 'Brother Jeffs, I have had inspiration concerning you, and I prophesy in the name of the Lord that the time will come when you will be inspired to enter into this law of plural marriage.'"
Wow.
So if you don't know, do you know the name Timpson as well?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So Lenora Timpson was Alma Adelbert Timpson's sister.
Okay.
Who became future apostle on the priesthood council.
Yep. Prominent names down south still, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, and so Lenora Timpson is the mother of Rulon Timpson Jeffs.
Okay.
Also, he writes, "When Lenora's father heard of it, we went to Bishop Rockwood and gave him the understanding that Apostle John W. Taylor, when Lenora's father heard of it, he went to the bishop and gave him the understanding that Apostle Taylor or my father had married us. The bishop asked me to come to his home one evening and meet with him and his first counselor, which I did in the upstairs of my bishop's home. He told me what Lenora's father had told him and wanted to know if I was married to Lenora by either Apostle John W. Taylor or my father, who was a patriarch. And I told them it was not true, that we were not married." And they said that was all they wanted to know. So, to my knowledge, he was probably cut off when he joined the fundamentalist movement many years down the road, but he escaped at that point, I do believe.
Ooh, so now this is interesting because now there's active hunting going on, if you will, right?
There is, and the Salt Lake Tribune's publishing crap like crazy at this point. They published that thing on Musser in 1907 when he went to Tolman to get his marriage done. And things are just coming out like crazy at this point. I don't have the documentation for that handy, but there was a serious campaign from the Salt Lake Tribune around this time, which was pretty much putting the church on blast again, just like it was during the Reed Smoot hearings and just like it was in 1890, right?
So you're saying the only thing that really is that you can really count on is death taxes, and the Salt Lake Tribune will always be a piece of crap rag that just has it out for the church.
Pretty much.
In general.
Pretty much. This is where it gets super interesting. We're going. I love it. I love the stuff about Alpha J Higgs. So Alpha J Higgs was a secretary to Heber J. Grant when Heber J. Grant was serving as mission president in England. On March 16th, 1909, Heber J. Grant writes in his diary, had a long talk with brother Alpha J. Higgs regarding the manifesto issued by the church. I learned that some people think that there is still a chance for plural marriages to be performed. Notwithstanding this manifesto and all the declarations that have been made by the presidency and the apostles, Brother Higgs assured me that he would use his influence to correct any such impression as this.
Nice. Nice.
Little does he know at this point. June 23rd, 1909, John W. Taylor marries his sixth wife, Ellen G. Sandberg. According to D. Michael Quinn, this earns John W. Taylor the distinction of being the only recorded man to have been married to 4 post-manifesto plural wives. He married Ellen Georgina Sandberg, possibly without asking permission of Joseph F. Smith. Apostle Cowley performed the ceremony. And Judson Tolman performed a plural marriage for John W. Taylor's sister-in-law earlier that month. I don't know which marriage that was, but also another connection of Tolman and Taylor.
Yeah. They the network is in place now, right? You can see it. It may not have complete form, but the players are in place.
It's not organization in the sense that they're trying to be the leaders of the church.
No.
Or a separate organization. It is purely to keep the principle of plural marriage alive until the circumstances are right for the church to readopt it.
Right. Which we have, per our conversation about Joseph Musser, that was the understanding, right? Is that at some point this will, the feeling was it would be sooner than later.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, the cat gets out of the bag at some point, and members of the Quorum of the 12 find out that John W. Taylor married another wife. And according to John W. Taylor and other sources, Apostle George Albert Smith, future president of the church, condemned John W. Taylor for that marriage and suggested that this was adultery. And for this, John W. Taylor threatened to kill him in a moment of passion, but instead used his priesthood to curse him in the name of the Lord. And John W. Taylor, according to D. Michael Quinn, says that George Albert Smith's nervous breakdown from the period of time from 1909 to 1911 was a direct result of that curse.
Wow.
So John W. curses George Albert in the name of the Lord and he has a mental breakdown that lasts at least 2 years.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, he struggles with it throughout the rest of his life, right? It's not as bad as breakdown, but he still is dealing with anxiety and depression through most of his life, if I'm not mistaken.
I think I heard that before. I wanted to read something to you that kind of sheds some light on why it is appropriate that John W. Taylor did such a thing to curse someone, an apostle in the church. There is something that has been done in the very much, at least in the higher circles of the church, and is done in the higher circles of fundamentalism. It has been perpetuated to this day in some circles. It started with Joseph Smith. You can actually find it in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith on page 106, but it's called, well, fundamentalists call it the Oath of Brotherhood. But basically the way it reads is, and so Joseph Smith put people under this covenant before he gave them their washing of the feet.
Mm-hmm.
And the covenant goes, and I will now covenant with you before God that I will not listen to or credit any derogatory report against any of you, nor condemn you upon any testimony beneath the heavens, short of that testimony which is infallible, until I can see you face to face and know of a surety. And I do place unremitted confidence in your word, for I believe you to be men of truth. And I ask the same of you, when I tell you anything, that you place equal confidence in my word, for I will not tell you I know anything that I do not know.
Hmm.
And
That's
so
awesome.
George Albert Smith was in violation of the oath of brotherhood by
Yep.
slandering John W. Taylor without going to him face to face and hearing about it.
Well, and look, at some level, I mean, John W.'s got to be getting tired of it, right? He's resigned. He's he's probably maligned in a lot of circles within the church. And quite frankly, I mean, Joseph F. Smith is still alive at this point, right?
Yep.
And so he probably feels like, yeah, I was a ram in the thicket, but I'm still operating based on the call I got.
Yep. Um, so we covered that. On July 6, 1909, Heber J. Grant writes in his diary, "This morning I had a visit from Carl A. Badger and his mother Louisa A. Badger. From them I learned the sad news that Bessie Badger had no doubt been married to Alpha J. Higgs. After all the warnings that I had given to Brother Higgs in Liverpool and since his return, that no person should enter into plural marriages, I feel outraged at his conduct and hope and pray that we may be able to discover who performed the marriage, as I feel that the man who performed such a ceremony, as well as those entering into a relation of this kind, ought to be excommunicated from the church."
And that's Heber J. Grant, right?
Yep.
So
So Heber,
is this the first
what?
time we can see Grant going full tilt the other direction now?
Yeah, and yeah, it's because of a friend and a former secretary of his pretty much had lied to him, about discouraging people into, entering into the principle. He'd entered into the principle himself, and it's coming out. So now the witch hunt's going to begin for Judson Tolman because they want to find out who officiated for Brother Higgs. On July 8th, 1909, in a meeting of the Quorum of the 12, Grant writes in his diary that Brother Lyman called upon each and every one of the brethren to give him their aid in stopping plural marriages in the future. The brethren were all united in condemning the course of Brother Higgs. Had a talk with Brother Alpha J. Higgs. He positively refused to confess whether he was married or had any relations whatever with Bessie Badger. Had another talk with Ralph and Carl Badger, those would be her brothers, who called at my home this evening, and from what they tell me, I am convinced that their sister has been married to Brother Higgs.
Mm.
The next day, Grant writes in his diary, had another talk with Higgs, but utterly failed to get any information from him. I forbade him from entering the temple or attending any of my prayer circle meetings. He is a member of my circle. I gave him plainly to understand that I considered that he was worthy of excommunication from the church. So Alpha J. Higgs was a member of Heber J. Grant's personal True Order of Prayer Quorum as well.
Wow. So maybe, just speculating here, maybe it's not so much that he was spurned with a certain lady. Maybe that played some of it. But maybe it's the fact he's feeling threatened in his authority somewhat.
Maybe, maybe. 6 days after that, he writes in his journal, this morning and afternoon, 7 of the apostles met in the temple. Bishop Joseph Christensen, Benjamin S. Goddard, Charles Martin, J. H. Martineau, and others of the brethren were examined as to their knowledge regarding the alleged marriage of Brother Higgs. None of them had any actual knowledge of the case, but all seemed to believe that somebody had presumed to marry him and claimed that it was all right. The next day after that, Heber J. Grant writes in his journal that, quote, Kelch thought Higgs was married, and if it was done properly and revealed to Higgs, he did not object. Now, that would be a reference to Louis Alma Kelch Sr., who was also a post-manifesto polygamist and father to future apostle Lewis Kelch Jr. And he's telling Heber J. Grant straight up, well, if it was done properly and if it was revealed to him, it's all good, right?
Yeah.
and
Almost not like he sounds almost oblivious, right, of what's going on, right? Like I don't see what the big deal is.
that or he's brave and he's very strongly asserting that that's the way he feels.
Right.
In any case, so Kelch is also on the general board of the YMMIA at this time. There's a lot of those guys who are getting cut off or are going to get cut off because they're entering into plural marriage, which is super interesting. Joseph Tanner is one of them. And Kelch and Higgs, they all were members of the YMMIA.
And the YMMIA, that's the Young Men's Mutual Improvement Association, right?
Correct.
Now, would they be considered the forerunners to like CES?
I don't know. That's a good question. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. On July 20th, 1909, Heber J. Grant writes, had a talk with B.H. Roberts and Ida Dusenberry regarding plural marriages that are being performed at the present time, and I learned that Brother Cowley was supposed to be quoted as saying that these marriages could be performed today as well as they ever could, and that it was all right to perform them. These reports had come to Brother Roberts and Sister Dusenberry, and I am hoping that they are not true, because if Brother Cowley is saying anything of this kind, it is an outrage. I would naturally think that after having been dropped from the Quorum of the 12, that he would not pressure to make any such remarks. I understand he is a very sick man, or I would investigate the case at once.
Now that's an interesting way that he phrased that, right? Resign versus drop, right? Yeah. It's almost like in this one entry, he shows his cards, right? Where they were kicked out. They weren't necessarily we allowed them to say resign to save face. But right. So that would lend credence to the idea that maybe Heber J. Grant had some foreknowledge of maybe this plan that was hatched to move the church in a direction of monogamy being the rule.
At this point, it's more likely that that's the direction that he wants to go in. July 22nd, 1909, Anthony Ivins writes, met at 9 a.m. to continue the investigation of the Alpha J. Higgs case. Brother Joseph Summerhays was the first person examined. So they're going over all the people that they know that have been involved, right? He's able to keep his membership. Brother Clark from Farmington, Utah, was the next person examined. So now they got Nathan G. Clark that they're investigating over Higgs' marriage. Both men refused to answer questions asked. They thought men were justified in taking plural wives now, provided they could get them properly. Thought there might be a proper way to get a plural wife. At 4 p.m., reconvened. Rodney Badger, first examined, knew nothing in regard to the marriage of his daughter, Bessie, and Alpha J. Higgs. Hugh J. Cannon had taken no wife and had given no encouragement to anyone to take plural wives. So, if I remember correctly, Hugh J. Cannon was a son of George Q. Cannon, who George Q. Cannon helped enter into the principal right before he died, along with John M. Cannon, who was his nephew. So that's a lie.
Yeah.
Because you. Anyways, can we pause there for a second? I could use a break.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I'll be right back.
All right.
Okay, so getting back into the Inquisition time period with Alpha J. Higgs, and they haven't found Judson Tolman yet, but they're gonna soon. Interesting sidebar. August 15th, 1909, John M. Whitaker, who is a bishop in Granite Stake, he's not a friend of ours, unfortunately. But this is interesting historically. He writes in his diary, I have had some serious time lately with some brethren who are determined to privately take plural wives against the solemn pledge that the church has made. And I have met with them and done all I could to get them to be true to their first wife, and under the instructions from the president of the church, had finally told them if they took another wife while their wife was living, we would have to handle them for their fellowship. But even this is not sufficient in some cases. The presidency said many times this must stop. During the balance of the summer, was extremely busy in my ward, stake, and social affairs. I had several talks with the stake presidency over my attitude towards some who are in polygamy, stating that all who took wives since the manifesto were living in adultery, and some of the leading men in the stake who had done so protested. And in the High Council, I explained my position, and the president of the stake asked me why I took such a stand, and he said he and John M. Cannon had been advised by one of the general authorities to do so. So he's telling his stake president and counselor that you're living in adultery because it's Frank Y. Taylor and John M. Cannon, right? Anyways, explaining that they did so and that the matter had been taken up by the Council of the 12, and inasmuch as they did so immediately after the manifesto and had made all arrangements in good faith to do so when the manifesto was passed, that unless someone made complaint against them, so far as the council was concerned, no action would be taken. We have had many meetings on the matter, and I was told by President Joseph F. Smith, no matter who they were, to handle all who had taken a wife after the manifesto, or he would handle me. This thing must stop. And later, one of the members of the ward, Willard Richards, came and asked me why I favored my brother-in-law, who was a member of my ward and also stake president, and not make fish of one and fowl of another. And he said he knew that Frank Y. Taylor had taken once since, and I said to him, "Are you sure?" "Yes, I am sure." Then I said, "If you will file a complaint against President Frank Y. Taylor or anyone else in my ward, I would at once try the case." "I'll do nothing of the kind," said he. Then said I, "Then keep your mouth shut and don't go and try to destroy the character of anyone if you will not take your part in stopping such things. It is such men as you and others who talk and slander others, but unwilling to help put a stop to such things, and you and all such are bringing the church into disrepute and give license for the stranger to find fault and say the church is not keeping its oath." President Smith told me personally when I took Nicole Hood before the presidency in 12 some time ago, "The man is not living and the man is not dead who can ever say that I have ever approved of a single plural marriage since the manifesto." And I believe him. So that's what John Whitaker says President Smith told him, that there is not a man living or dead that I told could enter into plural marriage since the manifesto. And I told him that President Taylor was good and a faithful man and always wanted to do the right thing. And I went to President Taylor myself and told him a complaint was about to be filed against him. He said, "Well, Bishop Whitaker, you won't try the case, will you?" "Yes, anyone filing such a deposition I am bound to hear." Then he said, "Well, Bishop, if such a thing happened, I guess I will have to take my medicine." But no one ever filed a complaint, so the matter was dropped. But I shall do as the president of the church asks me as long as I am bishop. I feel that it is right, and there is no one so great but that the Lord can raise up another to carry on the work. This is not a one-man church, and every member has equal rights before the Lord. I have had many sleepless nights over my determination to do my full duty in the face of great odds, but I shall always stand for the right and will express my honest opinions whenever and wherever I have opportunity, and it is my duty to do so. I cannot do otherwise and maintain my self-respect before men and my Father in heaven.
Let me ask. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's interesting. There you go.
Any idea who called Whitaker as bishop?
No idea.
Because he seems out of place, right? And he seems unusually bold to call out his direct superior, so to speak, right?
Very bold.
He seems look, we all understand Mormon hierarchy, right? Whether you're in or out of the mainstream church, we get it, that there are channels and that there is a proper procedure but he seems awfully emboldened, right? He seems like he's very willing to go out and challenge his direct superior within that hierarchy, which to me tells me that he was maybe put in there in hopes of stemming some of the plural marriage that's happening in Polygamyville.
It's quite possible, but I don't. Yeah, I don't know entirely.
Hmm.
Anyway, that's super interesting stuff. September 1st, 1909, Heber J. Grant writes in his diary, long discussion, Higgs' case concerned that Tanner and Kelsch should resign from the general boards. He means from the YNMIA. The next day, Grant writes, long talk afternoon with B.H. Roberts. He was glad something was to be done in the case of Tanner and Kelsch. 2 days after that, on the 4th, Joseph F. Smith and Heber J. Grant and B.H. Roberts sign a letter to Lewis A. Kelsch saying, evidences are at hand going to show that at a comparatively recent date, a plural marriage was entered into, and from a report made to us by a committee of the Quorum of the Twelve as a result of their investigations, you are implicated as having encouraged the belief that plural marriages may still be consummated, notwithstanding the declarations of the presiding authorities of the Church to the contrary. For this reason, we cannot sustain you as a member of the General Board of the Young Men's Mutual Improvement Association, and you are therefore hereby released as a member of that board.
Hmm. Wow. So
brother,
it's happening now, right? The witch hunt is on.
yeah. Kelshin and Tanner, I believe, get dropped from their position there, although I don't believe they ever get excommunicated. On October 6th, 1909, Heber J. Grant writes in his diary, after a conference at President Lyman's with some of the apostles in Bishop's Building, with President Welling of Bear River Stake, was sorry to learn that he believed that Brother Israel Barlow III of Bountiful Ward had married a plural wife. We will no doubt have one more man to cut off the church.
Ooh. And Hebert doesn't seem to have any time for it now. He's over it.
Yep. The next day, he writes, met at President Lyman's, some of the apostles, Brother Israel Barlow III there refused to answer any questions regarding his reported marriage. All of our quorum who were there believe him guilty.
Has there been any change in the constitution of the 12? Has anyone else been dropped? Has anyone died? Have they added more anti-polygamous candidates at this point?
Let me pull up who is in at this point in 1909, and I'll give you a rundown. As of August of 1909, the Quorum of the 12 reads, with Francis Lyman, John Henry Smith, Heber J. Grant, Rutger Clausen, Reed Smoot, Hiram Mack Smith, George Albert Smith, Charles Penrose, George F. Richards, Orson F. Whitney, David O. McKay, and Anthony W. Ivins. So against it, you have Lyman, Grant, Smoot, George A. Smith, Penrose, and George F. Richards, and Ivins. That's a majority of 7. On the fence, kind of, sort of, would be John Henry Smith, possibly Hiram Mack Smith, although I don't fully know, and David O. McKay. So 3 or 4, and then pro. Yeah, 3, and then pro would be Rutger Clausen and Orson F. Whitney.
So they're really outnumbered now.
Yeah. On October 6th, 1909, George F. Richards writes in his journal, I attended the fore and afternoon meeting of conference, and at 4 p.m. met with the 12 at President Francis M. Lyman's office and heard what President Milton H. Welling had to tell about his sister's relation with Brother Israel Barlow, a suspicious case indicating a marriage with a married man. Adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow when Brother Barlow will meet with us. I got word to him through brother Benjamin Goddard. Thomas Clausen writes in his journal that same day, the names of Alpha J. Higgs, Henry S. Tanner, and Lewis A. Kelch were not sustained on the general board of the YMMIA because of the scandal arising out of the Higgs affair. President Joseph F. Smith then made the closing remarks of the conference, in which he gave a most scathing rebuke to Brother B.H. Roberts and said that if the Lord had anything to say to the church, he would send it through the proper channel. So I guess B.H. Roberts said something at that conference that really was incendiary. I don't know what it was, but that's interesting. But in any case, Alpha J. Higgs, Henry Tanner, and Lewis Kelch get dropped from their positions in the YMMIA officially. The next day after that, Thomas A. Clausen, which is probably a near relative of Rudger Clausen, although I don't know, writes in his journal, went to circle meeting at President Francis M. Lyman's, spoke at Francis M. Lyman spoke upon the subject of loyalty to him and the circle, remarking that 4 members of the circle had gotten into difficulties through their not following the counsel of the leaders of the church. They were Joseph W. Musser, Joseph M. Tanner, Lewis A. Kelch, and Eardley, whoever that is. He hoped that in the future that all the brethren of the circle would live as to retain his fullest confidence and would do nothing to bring themselves into trouble the church into disrepute. So maybe I'm skipping over where I wanted to talk about Musser more. Maybe it's coming up. I don't know. We'll just get to it now. But yeah, so Musser, Tanner, Joseph M. Tanner, and Lewis A. Kelch were all part of Francis Lyman's private True Order of Prayer Quorum. Those 3 and another guy with the last name of Eardley apparently got into plural marriages around this time. This is the time that Joseph Musser was brought into the Quorum of the 12. It was during the Higgs case stuff.
Okay.
And if you recall, they asked him, do you know Brother Alpha J. Higgs? And he said that they had been personal friends for years, which that's like a no-brainer to me if Joseph Musser, well, I guess Higgs is not a member. Higgs is not a member of this quorum. Musser is a member of Lyman's quorum. Higgs is a member of Grant's quorum, True Order of Prayer Circle quorum. But yeah, so Higgs and Musser had been friends for years. That's the way he answers them. They ask him, well, have you talked about this topic? He says basically, well, I can't say. They ask Musser to put it, help us in putting it down. Musser says, I can't do that. Anyways, we discussed that at length before, but what's your question?
It's more of an observation. For some reason, I bristle at the way Lyman puts it, where he says,
Oh, yeah.
You have not been loyal to me. And I'm
I
like,
caught that.
Is this the Godfather, right? Is this like, you come to me on my wedding day and, what is this exactly? What do you mean loyal to you? Right? That's an interesting statement. I'm more concerned with someone being loyal to God rather than loyal to me.
Well, I would say that those 4 individuals were being pretty loyal to the Lord.
Yep.
3 of them are very prominent in the story. I don't know who Eardley is, but to have 3 names like that, all engaged in this underground priesthood work, and 2 of which have serious relations to later fundamentalism, is super interesting that happened in that scenario. Is super fascinating.
Yep.
Later on, when Joseph Musser is on the priesthood council, he sends Joseph Lyman Jessup and Arnold Boss, who was kind of the resident historian of the priesthood group at that point, up to Canada in the 1930s to go find Alpha J. Higgs because he had moved up to Canada to bring him into the priesthood work. Just so you know.
Okay. So Higgs is laying low, is what he's doing.
Yeah, he says, or maybe it was Boss or Musser, so Musser sends them off on that mission to go find Alpha J. Higgs. And Alpha J. Higgs told Arnold Boss and Lyman Jessup that he was instructed to go hide in Canada.
Okay.
Yeah, by probably Joseph F. Smith.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Heat's coming on. Get out of town.
Yep. And so yeah, we see this is coming down both sides. Anyway, Heber J. Grant writes on his journal on October 17th, 1909, that they were meeting on the Higgs case again and on Tanner and Kelsch. It's around this time that Nathan Clark was trying to obtain permission from Joseph F. Smith and John W. Taylor to marry Alta Taylor, John W.'s daughter. He got permission from John W. I don't know if he was able to obtain permission from Alta to court her, but it looks like Joseph F. Smith said that that would not be wise at this point in time. It's kind of understandable that we answer that question now that you asked before, maybe why he couldn't get permission, because that all this is going on right now. I mean, literally, you have Higgs's marriage was probably helped arranged by Taylor because he married his brother-in-law's daughter. Going on, December 8th, 1909, George F. Gibbs writes a letter to Lauren Merrill, who is probably a son of Mariner Merrill. He writes, "Word has come to this office from quite a reliable source to the effect that your counselor, Brother Borkman, has the idea that plural marriages are still being solemnized by and with the sanction of authorities of the church, and that in this understanding he is paying his addresses to a young woman with a view to marriage, provided he can get a competent person to perform the marriage ceremony. It is also being told that you are encouraging Brother Borkman in the idea. You are reported to have said other things as well along this line, going to convey the idea that you knew personally of such things and could enumerate a very large number of such marriages since President Wilford Woodruff's manifesto. I am instructed to say to you that no plural marriage can be entered into by and with the sanction of church authority, and that any person found doing so will be dealt with on his fellowship in the church. This applies to the party solemnizing a plural marriage, and you were requested by the presidency to so inform Brother Borkman and his wife as well." So that's another tie-in to Brother Merrill. Has a wide knowledge
Right.
pertaining to those events and affairs. So now getting into 1910, January, they start investigating Israel Barlow III's case. Let's see if I need to read any of this. So this is interesting. I couldn't find, I swear I read something along these lines, but I was looking for it before we got on. So yeah, with Israel Barlow III getting into his inquisitions, his stake president was Joseph Hiram Grant, who was a brother to Heber J. Grant. I swear there is a statement from either Judson Tolman or from Israel Barlow III that Joseph Hiram Grant, brother to Heber J. Grant, encouraged that marriage.
Ooh. Thanksgiving dinner just got interesting.
Right. And they have, because he's a stake president, they have Joseph Hiram Grant sitting in on this meeting, and things could be probably very uncomfortable for him. Anyway, so they're investigating. Israel Barlow declines to answer any of the questions, and they decide to disfellowship him. And if he continues to refuse to answer, then in 30 days, they will cause him to reappear in a meeting and show why, basically they're going to say he should show us why we shouldn't just excommunicate him from the church in 30 days. Anthony W. Ivins writes, same thing. Okay, let's move on.
Can you tip your camera down a little bit there, Mike?
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good.
But this is interesting. Okay. February 27th, as they're going through the Israel Barlow case, George F. Richards had a dream. I don't know the interpretation, but it's very interesting. Last night I dreamed a dream in which I saw that the 12, who had been digging for some time, had found the grave which contains the body for which they had been looking. The Barlow case and the subject of secret plural marriages were associated in my dream with the case, i.e., the dream, if it had any significance, refers to that matter. I dreamed that I had been absent for some time, and on my return, I saw a long and deep trench dug as indicated by the dirt thrown up. I had seen that we were in council and that I had been absent from, and from a drawer I extracted some papers which throw some light upon the case under consideration, and it was apparent that one of our number, Orson F. Whitney, had tried to keep this information in obscurity. On the diggings, I saw one who was persistent in humming out loud as he worked, notwithstanding we were to work in the quiet. He was nevertheless as much interested in our search as any others. President Francis M. Lyman was working hard when I came up and on the lead, and I put to work with him, and presently, working backwards, I discovered a loose sod as if it had formerly been removed. Investigating further, I found that a grave had been dug and covered over with sods, but that it had been sunken distinctly. President Lyman saw it, and it seemed that was the thing which we had been looking for, i.e., in that grave was the body we had been looking for. I then asked President Lyman if I should cover up the diggings to which he referred, and answered, "No, I want to show it to them." I thought I saw that there were a good number of men otherwise who had secretly hid this body from us, and I could see their anxiety over the matter and how disconcerted they felt while we were digging. I saw a shovel, a spade, and a grubbing hoe, which had been used in the diggings, and which it seemed I had used in the commencement of the work. So that's really fascinating. What are your thoughts on that?
Boy, I think just my opinion. I think that that what they're looking for is plural marriages, right?
Yep, sure.
And as soon as they find it, there's some men who are bothered by the fact that it was found, which probably lends to this idea that, again, they're not 100% united on this, right? I'm guessing those two men that you mentioned that were the only two left holding the line, so to speak, are those guys.
Well, that fits really well with what we went over with the membership of the quorum at this point, because the people he mentioned are the one that he mentions, it's Orson F. Whitney, who is one that we know is sympathetic, and the other one is Roger Clausen that we isn't mentioned in this stream, but we know that he would also probably be very wary as well.
And I'm just thinking, looking, digging below the surface, people are in the underground.
Mm-hmm.
I think it carries a lot of symbology there.
It's really interesting. It's why the Lord would show him that, I don't know. Some would probably take that as a vindication that the Lord was against the priesthood work. I would disagree, obviously, but it could be looked at that way. But interesting nonetheless, considering how accurate it is.
I think there's something else telling in that dream. And the one who seems most excited about finding the body, so to speak, is Lyman. Which tells me that maybe he was the mastermind of this from the get-go.
Yeah, I think it would make a lot of sense if that were the case. I'll say that much. I couldn't prove that, but it would make a lot of sense. Nor have I ever attempted to research that there was a plot in any case, but that is what
I could be up in the night on this, right? I really could be up in the night.
Well,
but it just seems too orchestrated for me.
It's definitely orchestrated at a certain level, and I'll give him the benefit of saying the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions, and I'm sure he had good intentions and that he wasn't completely evil in doing this because he's trying to do something he believes in, which is to save the church from disrepute. But I definitely think he's gone beyond the spirit of the Lord at this point as well.
I think this is a good spot to maybe mention saving at what extent? To what extent, right? Because if he gets his way, the church as those people have known it to that time is over. Right? That's like saying I'm going to attempt this Mustang by throwing in a Pinto engine. Right? Yeah, you may have saved the outward appearance, but it's not the same car.
You're absolutely right about that. Going forward, this is extremely interesting timing wise. So September 28th, on the heels of this, let's see, when was this dream? This dream, so a year later almost. So February, that dream was February 27th. Um, on September 28th, they officially excommunicate Israel Barlow III from the church. Um, by October 3rd, just a few days after that, Judson Tolman is excommunicated from the church. So
Interesting.
boom. According to D. Michael Quinn, in October, which is in that same month that Tolman is excommunicated, in October of 1910, John W. Taylor, I'll just read what he says. John W. Taylor was circulating that 1886 revelation, which the apostles saw as kind of sedition, as a kind of effort to undermine the church. And then they heard in October of 1910, when the first presidency announced a letter to all stake presidents for stake presidents to take action against anyone entering into plural marriages after 1904, John Taylor said, quote, "This church is going to divide in two, and there will be a monogamous church and there will be a polygamist underground." End quote, I guess. And when that was reported back to the Quorum of the 12, they regarded John W. Taylor as not simply a rebel, but as a potential or actual leader of a movement that the apostles could only see as an apostate group. So it was basically a foregone conclusion that he would be excommunicated when he came before the Quorum of the 12.
Wow.
And so on the heels of Israel Barlow III being exed and Patriarch Tolman being exed, the first presidency is compelled, I would say, to issue a statement to the stake presidents to fellowship, to exercise judgment when cases come up to them. And John W. Taylor makes that prophecy that there will be a polygamous faction in the church from this point forward, and that the church will be divided into. Now, that is, again, just fascinating and fits with the narrative that we're uncovering.
Any
Now,
any sort of idea what's happening with Joseph F. Smith? Do we have any journal entries that show any sort of, lamentations about, we've lost it? Anything that can really tip his hand about where he's standing at this point?
I've never seen any journal entries from him on anything like that. If they exist, they're probably definitely not available. I will state that out of the 18 marriages that Tolman performed between February of 1906 and when he's excommunicated in 1910, it includes Joseph Musser. Joseph Musser is not excommunicated for the marriages performed by Tolman. Very interesting, right?
Right.
James A. Eldridge was also protected by Joseph F. Smith and was not excommunicated. Neither was Dan Muir, who was the bishop that helped Judson Tolman take two wives. He was not excommunicated from the church. And neither was Henry S. Tanner excommunicated from the church, despite the fact that when Tolman is brought into account for all of that, and after he admits all of this, all that information is before the Quorum of the 12.
Do you think that the Quorum of the 12 is thinking at this point, we kind of have bigger fish to fry? Right? Like, if kind of like that, I hate to use this analogy, but I don't know how else to use it. There was a point during the drug war in America where it was like, go after the cartels, right? Get rid of the supplier. Are they looking at maybe John W. Taylor and Matthias Callias kind of being like the suppliers to this, and thoughts are if we can get rid of the figureheads, the rest will fall in line.
There's definitely a little bit of that. At this point, it's looking like that the 12 think that Cowley is more responsible than Taylor.
Okay.
Um, I don't know if that's true. I think he's more of the boots on the ground, and Taylor's more um, directing from behind at this point. I don't know how completely in union they are either. But like I said, I very much think that any of Nathan Clark's suggestions to Judson Tolman was actually really Taylor's. Um, and we see that after Judson Tolman is excommunicated, he being patriarch to the church, I don't know if there was anyone in the interim placed in that position, but in 1913, John W. Woolley is placed in the position of patriarch to Davis Stake that Judson Tolman was occupying.
Okay. Interesting that they replace him with a Woolley.
Well, yeah, with also connections to John W. Um, but yeah, as you were saying, that the bigger fish to fry, we're getting into that point in time where we're in the end of 1910, and the summons for Taylor and Cowley to appear on trial were in February of 1911.
Okay.
Do I need a pause? I need a pause.
No problem.
Okay, where was I? Um, so Quinn writes that before his membership trial, John W. Taylor wrote a letter to Joseph F. Smith wherein he referred to him as, quote, prophet, president, and king. In the same letter, he asks Joseph F. Smith to convene the Council of 50 to protect John W. Taylor from discipline by the Quorum of the 12. President,
Whoa.
President Smith responds, quote, not granted, I think the demand most absurd. Although the request was denied, it strongly suggests that Apostle Taylor believed that there was a reasonable possibility that Joseph F. Smith would take his side and protect him against the membership trials.
So I'm going to ask a real blunt question now. Did, in your opinion, did Joseph F. Smith throw Taylor to the wolves at this point?
I don't know if throwing him to the wolves is the right answer, but it's like my hands are tied.
Okay. Which
I
is
think
it?
it'd be more accurate.
Which is fascinating, right? Because we, again, thinking about Mormon hierarchy, especially within the church, he can pull rank. He can pull rank unless he's not really in control.
Right. You're absolutely right. And that goes back to that tradition that Francis Lyman was trying to find evidence to lock up Joseph F. Smith because he suspected Joseph F. was involved with these things.
And look, I'm a guy who believes that organizations, businesses, whatever, have a kind of DNA to them. Okay. And if if that's the DNA that is there now, I'm not sure that just goes away, Michael. I think that sticks around, right? And so now we have to this has some implications for our day. Who really has the power and who really is pulling all the levers?
You're asking the right questions. I don't have the I don't have the specific answers, but I know what you're putting down. I know what you're putting down.
There may or may not be another episode coming that may dive in. I'm not saying there is, but you should probably count on it. But anyway,
Fair enough. Fair enough. Uh, Back to Israel Barlow's case. I forgot about this part. Um, they're having him back to talk about why he felt justified in taking another wife. Interesting scenario. He forges a postscript or a PS, at the end of a letter that he had from Owen Woodruff, back when Owen Woodruff was alive. That Owen Woodruff had written to him from when Owen was in Colorado, and he had a secretary like type put the paper back or a copy of that paper back in a typewriter and typed a PS with instructions from Owen Woodruff to take his second wife and go down to Mexico or something like that. In any case, he presents that as evidence, trying to lay the blame on Owen Woodruff, who's dead. And Heber J. Grant discerns when looking at the paper that the type was different,
Okay.
and it was detected as a falsehood, unfortunately. And so I guess he couldn't salvage his membership at that level. But just an interesting little footnote. So we're getting into the trials now, but where did I? Yeah, okay. I'm not going to go into the reading any of the trial because, well, maybe a little bit, but because that would take probably 2 episodes. Maybe with 1. It would take like a whole episode to do.
Okay.
And it's not really relevant in its entirety to this topic. But I do have cliff notes to John W. Taylor's trial. I believe it was February 11th, 1911. No, February 22nd was probably the second date because they broke it up into 2 different days. So February 1911, the cliff notes are Joseph Fielding Smith, which is son of President Joseph F. Smith, admits to making a copy of the 1886 revelation that he got from Rodney Badger, who is brother-in-law to John W. Taylor, and who's the father of Alpha J. Higgs' second wife, right? So there's that connection.
Right.
The apostles spend all the time inquiring to John W. Taylor's personal activities. They ask him about Patriarch John A. Wolfe in Canada, who had been set apart by John W. Taylor and Joseph F. Smith. They talk about that for a bit. They ask him personal questions about him marrying his 6th wife, Ellen Sandberg Taylor, and he refuses to answer any questions regarding that, though he does give some information regarding other plural marriages. He refuses to utterly say anything about his own personal affairs, and he cites pleading the 5th from the Constitution as reason to do so. They ask him why are you pleading the 5th in a ecclesiastical meeting, and he tells them because and he quotes section 98 of the Doctrine and Covenants where it says from the Lord that you should require nothing of anyone that is less than or more than the Constitution, the law of the United States, which is lawful.
Dude, that makes my heart swell with joy.
And this is going to make it even better. Do you know who advised him as his legal counsel to do that?
Who?
John M. Cannon.
Nice.
So brother John M. Cannon tells Taylor to cite the 5th Amendment, not to answer any of those questions, as he shouldn't be forced to perjure himself. John W. Taylor tells the Quorum of the 12 that he had a 3.5-hour conversation with President Joseph F. Smith and John Henry Smith between the sessions of the 2 sessions of the trial. In that, he also asked President Smith to reconvene the Council of 50. And interestingly enough, he also questioned Joseph F. Smith directly, saying, do you believe in the revelation that my father got in 1886? To which Joseph F. Smith told him, yes, I do believe it was a revelation from God. Then John W. Taylor asks President Smith, then why aren't you doing anything to facilitate it?
Wow.
There's some discord there at that, at least up to that level. They are now seemingly not in harmony when it seems like there had been harmony and understanding before.
What was Smith's response? Do we know?
I don't know.
Mm.
I don't know, besides the fact that a few years later, Joseph F. Smith and John Woolley appoint Nathan G. Clark and Joseph Musser to perform the priesthood work.
After the excommunication of John W. Taylor.
Correct.
I'm sorry, it smacks of a man who no longer has the authority to do what he wants to do.
Yep. No, I don't disagree with that.
Oh, geez. And I find it an interesting omission. Look, the absence of evidence usually isn't evidence in and of itself. But in this, at this stage, they're going to excommunicate Taylor and then continue to work and give commissions to men to keep doing plural marriage on the down low. The other thing I find interesting is that Taylor calls for the Council of 50 to be reinstituted, right?
Yep.
I think at this point, Taylor understands, and this is pure speculation on my part. I think Taylor understands that the Quorum of the 12 and the church as we've known it to this point is gone. And the only thing that can bring this back is kind of a higher council now, which would be the Council of 50.
Well, which is designed to protect everyone in their civil rights, their civil
Their
liberties.
religious rights, yeah.
Yeah. And which, even if he's at variance with the position of the Quorum of the 12, he still has the right to his own pursuit of happiness, right?
Right.
And yeah, I don't know how they would do that, because that's a dicey situation. Can the Council of 50 judge that in the church? Because the Council of 50 is not the church.
I don't know. Like, and now we get into speculation about just how much sway Joseph intended the Council of 50 to have in these matters.
Yeah.
Right.
And another historical note is that the Council of 50 has not been operative since at least 1892.
Right.
Up to this point.
True. Again, it just, I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but everything just points to kind of a takeover. I don't know how else to say it. And Taylor's trying to pull out every stop he can make to reverse this, and it's just not happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's an interesting footnote. Skipping to Matthias Cowley's trial and then back, but at Matthias Cowley's trial, which I believe was in May of 1911, they asked him if he had heard of a ring of people in the church who thought that John W. Taylor would one day be the president of the church. Now, that is very striking. At least this is very interesting information for several reasons, because we have that prophecy from John W. Taylor that there's going to be a schism in the church with two factions, one monogamist, one polygamist. We have knowledge that John W. Taylor has a network, if you can call it such, of people perpetuating celestial plural marriage. And there is a story told in Family Kingdom by Samuel Woolley Taylor, John W.'s son, that around this time, a fundamentalist leader came to John W. Taylor asking him to spearhead and be the figurehead for the movement. And the dialogue between them, it goes such as the trial was not legal because it was not a high council, therefore you're not cut off. It also seems to insinuate that you have higher priesthood keys and blessings anyways, which can't be taken from you,
right?
No matter what. And you have a duty to lead this people. The people will flock to your banner, and so forth and so on. Samuel Woolley Taylor takes because first of all, to say a fundamentalist leader or anything like that is kind of anachronistic, because fundamentalism hasn't happened yet, and Mark E. Peterson wasn't even a member of the Quorum of the 12 yet, and he coined the term Mormon fundamentalist. So you got to take some things said in that account by Samuel Woolley Taylor with some skepticism, but the themes across the board are very consistent from what I see. And that is, there probably was people from that network who were waiting for John W. Taylor to just come and lead the people. I don't know, like Moses, I don't know, out of Egypt, so to speak.
It would be interesting to know what Taylor's thoughts are on that, right? Because for a long time, and I would contend probably certainly into Brigham and Taylor's presidencies, Wilford's as well, there's this thing of just trying to hold the church together.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so now you're starting to come to a point at which they're like, well, maybe there needs to be a divorce, an ecclesiastical divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that Taylor doesn't pick up that banner. And I'm wondering why not.
Well, I think the truth is probably um, less the direction that Samuel Taylor takes it. Samuel Woolley Taylor paints it in such a way that John W. Taylor did not want to divide the church, and that part's true. Um, but that he also encouraged people not to form a group, and that he had a testimony of the church. And there are kernels of truth in that. I believe John W. Taylor had the discernment to know now was not the right time,
Okay.
and that with his charisma, it would have split the church before it was ready to be split. I
Okay.
guess.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay.
And he would die within a few years of that point, anyways, and so it would have been a short-lived. Uh, his tenure as a leader officially would have been short-lived, anyways.
Right. So he could, yeah. No, that makes sense. Okay. No, that makes sense.
All right, but interesting nonetheless that they ask him about if Matthias. They asked Cowley if he'd ever heard talk about Taylor being president of the church. Um, Back to Taylor's account, super interesting. I never would have caught this if I hadn't read the book Apostles on Trial by Drew Briney. Shout out to Drew Briney again, right? Um, he points out something super interesting in the flow. Like there's a deletion of part of the trial.
Mm.
And it resumes with Charles Penrose saying, I motion that we delete that or remove that from the record, as John W. Taylor said he will claim all responsibility, and then which John W. Taylor follows in the transcript, I will assume all responsibility.
Ooh. So do you think he says that he got his commission from Joseph F. Smith?
No, I do not believe he said that, because then that would have played into Francis M. Lyman's
That's a
alleged
good point. That's a
plot,
good
right?
point. That's a good
No,
point. What do you think it says?
I think he tells them about the Judson Tolman thing. And interestingly enough, if I can't quite make sense of this, but I would love to see some original source documents and not just the digital source documents that I have of minutes of the Quorum of the 12 from this time period. But in Charles Penrose's diary, because Penrose, again, is the one who motions that this part be stricken from a record, but in his journal, he writes February 22nd, arrived with it John W. Taylor, 9 of the 12 present as Taylor refused to comment on allegations that he continued to perform plural marriages and was taking additional wives on the grounds that he wanted to legally protect himself. However, Taylor complained of church influence in politics and admitted to giving Patriarch John W. Woolley authority to perform plural marriages. Producing a copy of a revelation to his father, John Taylor, he interpreted it to mean that the man who stood at the head of the church was relieved of the responsibility of holding the keys, and free agency was given to, quote, all my people.
Hmm. Okay. So
So
do
there's a
you,
lot to unpack there.
yeah, yeah. Well, and my mind immediately goes back to that um conversation that we talked about on a previous episode between Joseph Smith and John Taylor, where he says if these keys aren't used, they'll be turned against you.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
And at that level, it basically means, well, concerning this principle, it's kind of been turned against you. It's no longer within your purview as president of the church.
Very interesting, and I would not disagree with that. And that interpretation fits with the 1882 revelation, which is, "You are not fit to preside in my priesthood if you do not live my law."
Right. Right. Absolutely. Woo.
So interesting. So according to Penrose, and like I said, I would love to see a handwritten version of that, but I got that electronically, where he says that John W. Taylor authorized John W. Woolley to perform plural marriages. So I think he talked about that at the very least, and that was the part that was deleted. What makes me wonder why that is or how that could be, is because if John W. Taylor admits to that in 1911, why is it not that John W. Woolley isn't excommunicated until December of 1914?
Maybe they wanted to see, look, the church has some inkling here now, the Quorum of the 12 does, that Taylor seems to be the guy, right? They ask questions about, have you heard anything about Taylor starting his own church, or that he'll become president of the church? Maybe their thought is if we lop off this figurehead, the rest will fall into line.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very possible. Absolutely. Um, in that trial, John W. Taylor also says that it was one of the greatest tragedies in the church that Bishop Samuel Robinson was cut off from the church. Maybe he was cut off from the church, but he was the bishop in Mexico that George Albert Smith went to go replace, right? So, so John W. Taylor says that it was the greatest tragedy in the church that Samuel Robinson was cut off. That's probably a bit of an exaggeration, right?
Right.
And he goes on to say that he admires men like Henry Tanner and Nathan Clark. He also tells the 12 that at this point in time that he endorsed Nathan Clark's courtship of his daughter, Alta. He tells the 12 in this meeting that Joseph Robinson, from the mission president from California, right, asked for a copy of the 1886 Revelation with Matthias Cowley and got it from John's brother-in-law, Rodney Badger. They asked if he had married his typewriter as a plural wife. Her name, yeah, Ellen Sandberg. Her sisters, as we discussed earlier, married Walter W. Steed, who also lived in Farmington up in Davis County, and another sister married Thomas J. Steed. And when Thomas J. Steed died, she remarried Nathaniel Baldwin as his second wife.
Mm. Wow.
So that's super interesting. So Nathaniel Baldwin was the altruistic polygamous benefactor of the 1920s. With the radio plant, put all the polygamists to work, help them
Right.
subsidize the building of their houses in Forestdale. Um, his second wife was, so he basically becomes a brother-in-law to John W. Taylor. Brother Taylor's dead at that point, but that's all I'm saying. Dude, the connections to John W. Taylor are everywhere in this.
All roads
Uh,
lead to Taylor.
yeah. Um, his first wife, if I remember correctly, as a fun fact for other fundamentalists listening to this, was an Oler, which is a big name in First Ward or the FLDS,
Okay.
or up in Canada. So that's how I think how the Ohlers get involved, was that Nathaniel Baldwin's first wife was an Oler. The Sandberg family, so those three sisters, right, that have been married to John W. and the Steeds and Nathaniel Baldwin, come up in Baldwin's journal with Cowley and patriarch Homer Brown, father of future Apostle Hugh B. Brown, giving blessings to members of that family. Um, John W. Taylor tells the 12 that he has never married anyone without the permission of the president of the church in that meeting, which seriously upset Hiram Mack Smith, who's, because Hiram Mack Smith's father is the president of the church. I'll read that part to you. Hiram Mack Smith says, quote, "I think you have implied in your attitude that President Smith has not told the truth. I feel that Brother Taylor desires to imply that President Joseph F. Smith gave him the authority, but will not deny or affirm it. John W. Taylor says, Brother Hiram, if I should turn my tongue loose, there would be the damnedest time in this state you have ever had.
Ooh.
Hiram Mack Smith says, I think you're creating the damnedest time by keeping still. So Hiram Smith's getting upset with Taylor, insinuating that President Smith is behind everything, but not admitting it.
That's an interesting that's an interesting snippet, right? Because it sounds like Hiram has no idea that his dad Joseph has been engaged in the work like he has been.
Yeah, and he thinks it's absolutely silly, right? That he thinks so, but I don't think it's silly whatsoever. Let's see. Um, Anthony Ivins mentions in the trial that when they cut off Bishop Samuel Robinson told the 12 that he had gotten the right to enter into a plural marriage from John W. Taylor. So he got implicated in that association as well, that
Right.
way. Ivins said, I was instructed of President Smith to depose him from his bishopric, and I would like to know where the outrage exists. John W. Taylor says, I remember consulting with Brother Ivins about Robinson's case, he having been promised long before President Smith's declaration that he should have another wife. And I referred him to President Smith, and he came to Salt Lake and saw the president, and I returned to my home in Provo, where he called upon me one day in the field, and while talking, he broke down in tears, and I thought he was sad, but he said he was crying for joy. He said that President Smith told him to hunt out the way, and if he could find the way, the president said, God bless you. He said he had found the way and asked if he could send his wife to me, and I told him, yes, I would, and I will care for her as long as I could. And John said that he had no idea who married Robinson to his new wife. Probably John Woolley.
Right.
That's my guess. Could have been Tolman, but I don't recall seeing his name on the Tolman sealing record that I have. But so that's really interesting. So you have
Yeah.
Ivan saying that Robinson told the 12 that he got the right from Taylor. Taylor's recalling that all the interaction he had with Robinson was that Robinson had gone to President Joseph F. Smith and said, and he had been told to hunt the way out, right? And God bless you.
Yeah.
Some dialogue worth noting between Charles Penrose and John W. Taylor. Charles Penrose asks John, under this purported revelation from your father, do you think this authority is given to anyone to perform a plural marriage on their own free agency? John responds, if a man had been authorized in any way by authority to perform a marriage under that revelation, he would be. Charles Penrose then said, if a man had received authority at some time in the past, would he have authority now, notwithstanding the declarations of Presidents Snow and Smith? John says, it would depend upon the circumstances as to what was said to him at the time he received the authority and the condition under which he received it. I think there may be cases where a man might be justified in exercising the authority if he had the authority given to him at one time. I think the president of the church should give the authority to every man who performs a plural marriage.
Ooh.
I would not take advantage of this revelation after the opinion of your brethren and your ideas expressed here. George F. Richards then asked Taylor, have you, brethren, ever talked about a question of a division in the church and there being two factions in the church? So that topic comes up again in Taylor's meeting as well.
It would be interesting to see on the Temple Recommend interview questions when they said, there's that one question in the church where they ask, do you sustain so and so as the only person authorized on earth to exercise all the keys of the priesthood? I'd be fascinated to know when that question originated on a recommend interview.
I think during Heber J. Grant's presidency.
And that's interesting to note the time period,
Yep,
right?
absolutely. Um, Now for the verdict. The verdict of the trial, as stated in the official papers and all that, is quote, um, this is from Francis Lyman. Francis Lyman presented the following. Brother Taylor admitted of wrongs in Canada and Davis County. He tactically admits his late marriage with his typewriter. He has cursed and threatened his brethren. He has put out a purported revelation of his father's, which his father never presented to the church nor his brethren. His construction upon it is very mischievous and against the position and discipline of the church by the living oracles. It was in his power to have restrained Brother Cowley and Woodruff, meaning Owen Woodruff, right?
Right.
But instead, his course lent encouragement to them. He has had no change of heart since he resigned his position in the council. He has not met with us in a friendly manner and penitent spirit. He blames us instead of himself for his troubles. He said he never wants to be associated with the 12 in time or eternity. When his brethren reported his cursing of George Albert Smith, he said that they were liars. The action of the stake presidency and high council in the case of Bishop Robinson he denounces as the damnedest outrage ever perpetuated. In a threatening manner, he tells us of the awful things that would happen to the church if he should open his mouth and tell what he knows. He greatly admires Henry S. Tanner and Nathan Clark, who we have found to be unsafe men. His examples and words give comfort and encouragement to those inclined to override the discipline of the church.
Ooh. So, any idea if it was unanimous or if it was a simple majority?
It was unanimous in his case. Cowley's case was different. I don't remember off the top of my head if there was a difference in who was there for vice versa. You know, because I don't believe it was a full quorum in either case. It was enough to constitute a quorum, meaning 7 were present, which is the bare minimum to have a legal action for a quorum, at least in the case of the 12. But I did not believe it was a full quorum. John W. Taylor is therefore excommunicated, or it's announced in March 28th, 1911. But I want to go back to that verdict, which I believe supports my theory about that deletion, because Lyman presents that the verdict is that he admitted wrong. He's getting excommunicated partly for admitting wrongs in Canada and Davis County. Now, what happened in Davis County, Dave?
Joseph Woolley, I can't remember the first name. Woolley succeeds Judson as patron, right?
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that his admission that authority stems from him, so to speak.
I believe so.
Was what did it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really good connections there. That makes perfect sense to me. In any case, I could be wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong on that one.
No, there seems to be a lot of corroborating evidence that would bear that out.
Yep, and we're gonna get to more of it too, by the way. So he's excommunicated. Some tradition states that after his excommunication, he begins more fully to refer men to John W. Woolley for their blessings. On April 11th, 1911, this is so interesting to me because it validates a lot of what we've talked about the last 5 episodes. On April 11th, 1911, President Joseph F. Smith acknowledges in a telegram to Senator Reed Smoot that Taylor's understanding of the scope of the 1890 manifesto was not maverick. And I'm quoting Quinn, by the way. But this is what the telegram says. If President Roosevelt inquires about new polygamy, tell him the truth. Tell him that President George Q. Cannon was the first to conceive the idea that we could consistently countenance polygamy beyond the confines of the Republic, where we have no chartered law against it. And consequently, he authorized the solemnization of polygamy in Mexico and Canada after the Manifesto of 1890, and the men occupying presiding positions who became polygamists since the Manifesto did it in good faith.
Wow. That's a heck of an admission that they entered it in good faith.
Yeah, and I mean that was a telegram to Smoot, so obviously that got buried until Quinn found it. Smoot never put that out, probably, but that's hugely telling. And I think it's a bit of a gloss because I think Joseph F. Smith was just as involved as George Q. Cannon was, although he probably took a junior role because George Q. Cannon was senior by ordination. Uh, but he's literally saying George Q. Cannon orchestrated this whole thing, which uh, he was at John Woolley's house in 1886 when the 1886 revelation was received. We have Matthias Cowley's testimony during his trial that George Q. Cannon gave him the authority and got him as his go-to for all the marriages that were performed the last few years of Cannon's life. He performed at least 45 plural marriages in a span of 3 years that we know of.
Holy cow.
That is almost one plural marriage a month.
I was doing the math in my head here. Yeah, 52 weeks in a year. Last 3 years of his life, he's going to town.
It's more. It's more than one a month because 3 years is 36 months, 45 marriages. Yeah.
Holy cow. Whew. He's busy.
So that was Cannon and Cowley. May 10th, 1911, Matthias Cowley, during his trial, tells them, I was told to keep my own counsel and was severely censured one time by Brother George Q. Cannon for consulting someone else, meaning someone else other than him, regarding a certain marriage. Brother Penrose told me once in the city of Mexico that he had written the manifesto and it was gotten up so that it did not mean anything, and President Joseph F. Smith told me the same. I mention these things only to show the training I have had from those over me. So Cowley tells the Quorum of the 12 in his trial, Penrose told me he wrote the manifesto. We know that's true because George Reynolds told the Senate during the Reed-Smoot hearings that he and Charles Penrose and Franklin S. Richards wrote the manifesto. But also we know from the history that President Smith never believed the manifesto was a revelation abolishing plural marriage, and he said as much in a meeting of the Quorum of the 12 in 1891.
Man. I mean, it's like at the end, the smoking gun is found, right? We know who's responsible. We know who continues to authorize it. There's no doubts.
Absolutely. I agree. One thing also, they asked him about a certain marriage that they found out was performed for a Peter K. Lemon Jr., but they couldn't find out who performed the marriage. He didn't know, or maybe he did. I don't know. He denied knowing who did it, and they were married sometime, obviously before May of 1911, and it was performed in Centerville by John W. Woolley, who admitted it to the apostles when he was excommunicated a few years down the line. Also around this time period, Judson Tolman's been excommunicated already, but he gets brought back into meetings. On January 12th, 1912, Judson Tolman signs an affidavit saying, I, the undersigned, Judson Tolman, so by these present, confess and acknowledge in all sincerity and humility that since the first part of the year 1904, I have had married to me 2 women by Bishop Daniel Muir, that I have had at different times and places married 18 couples as follows.
Holy cow.
Bishop Daniel Muir, James A. Eldridge, Samuel Howard, Alpha J. Higgs, Henry S. Tanner with 2 women, Charles Woldenden, Israel Barlow III, a brother Evans, Joseph W. Musser, a brother Jeffs to two women, Dr. Donald A. McGregor, brother Simmons, a brother Gamble, a brother Merrill, and a brother Wells, and a brother Christensen in 1910, all of whom were recommended to me by brothers Matthias F. Cowley, Henry S. Tanner, or Nathan Clark. When I was investigated on the question of marrying these parties, I deliberately lied to the council of the 12 apostles and thus deceived them. Later, when I was again given a hearing, I acknowledged to marrying, but again willfully lied to the council by telling them I performed all those marriages before the declaration of Joseph F. Smith of April 1904, when they were all performed after that date. All these pretended marriages were done without any right or authority under the law of God or man. For all these great sins, I do now humble myself before God and ask his forgiveness and mercy, and also for the forgiveness of my brethren, whom I so wickedly deceived. I make this confession and acknowledgement of my own free will, that my conscience may be freed, for I have stood condemned before it since my first appearance before the council. I wish all my brethren who have been sinners with me would do as I have done and obtain forgiveness. And it's signed Judson Tolman, Jason Tolman, David Tolman, and Joseph Hiram Grant.
Wait. Why would okay? Why would Tolman do this? Because he's already exed, right? I mean,
Sure.
what's the motivation here? Is he trying to get back into the church? What's going on?
He was petitioning for rebaptism back into the church at this point. Absolutely. Um, in where he says that he lied, the first defense he made, which I believe I have on my phone, if I can pull that up. I don't have it on my computer, but I think I have that in front of me. He told the 12, I believe, that Mariner Merrill gave him the authority. And so it's just like Israel Barlow tried to put the responsibility and the weight back on Abraham Owen Woodruff. He
Right.
was trying, Judson Tolman was counseled, I believe, by Henry Tanner, who was a lawyer, to put the burden on Mariner Merrill, who was dead, because Mariner Merrill can't be tried.
Put it on a dead man and call it good, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, and so that's the thing that he lied about. But I definitely think the rest of this was just an attempt to get into the church. I don't think he really regretted it. And like we've seen, the evidence points that there was a commission of authority, and him not admitting to who it really was. He admits that he lied about brother Merrill commissioning him, but I think he really was protecting Joseph F. Smith, because remember, half the people that Judson Tolman married never got cut off the church.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I get it. I'm a little disappointed in Tolman that he went this route. Um,
Sure.
I'm a little bummed out. But it is what it is, right? And I can't judge what his intent was or anything like that. It just seems. I mean, you've already been exed, right? I mean, you're done essentially. Um,
Mm.
and it wouldn't be too much longer before we'd start seeing a leap from proto fundamentalism to full on fundamentalism in short order.
It's very true. He's not going to live that long. I mean, he was already 79, I think, in 1906. So Tolman wouldn't live to see that day. But I definitely don't think that admission was done in any way, shape, or form other than to try to get back on the church membership records before he died.
Okay. All right.
Doing it in a way to protect Joseph F. Smith, as we've discussed, because all signs kind of point to him
Mm-hmm.
being involved with it too, right? And like we said, Joseph Musser wasn't excommunicated from Tolman's marriages. Henry Tanner wasn't. James A. Eldridge wasn't, and there was another one that which we've already mentioned. Let me see if I can find more on Tolman from my phone. Maybe it's not Tolman. I might just have to read. We might come back to that. Hold on. 4 days later, President Lyman, in a meeting of the Quorum of the 12, says, "We have learned the first marriage he was connected with was when Bishop Daniel Muir was married a wife to him. Brother Tolman married the Williams woman first, the first in 1904 and the next in 1906. That's actually not true. They were both done in 1906, but he placed the marriage back further to kind of protect himself.
Gotcha.
The first in February, it was a woman by the name of Laxman. Bishop Muir was not the bishop of my ward. Joseph Hiram Grant said it was 1901 or 1902 that Brother Tolman came to him and made the statement about Sister Babbitt. Brother Tolman said Sister Babbitt is sealed to Brother George Teasdale, who's dead, but we love him anyways. He was not quite clear whether he was married before or after Brother Muir. There's a historical note that I have here that Brother Daniel Muir appeared at the same meeting and said that he had married his wife in 1903 and denied performing marriages for Tolman, which is also a lie. But
Right.
he never got excommunicated for it either. George F. Richards writes in his journal, "I met with President Francis M. Lyman and Joseph Fielding Smith Jr. and James E. Talmadge and heard President Joseph H. Grant report on Judson Tolman and Daniel Muir meet this morning. There are many developments in our investigations of a startling and astonishing character, which I do not record in my journal. Most of the proceedings of our investigations are taken in shorthand and transcribed and are kept for a future reference."
So that reference.
So what if? So this is already after Taylor's been excommunicated. What if that whole thing that we just read was a loss, the cover-up, that to tell Tolman, if you want any shot of being back in the church before you die, you need to sign this affidavit.
That's kind of where I was thinking.
That reads this way. While the truth is that George F. Richards is saying that all this astonishing and startling stuff is coming out, which we can't record.
Yeah. Yeah. No, they had him on the ropes, right? Tolman wants back in the church before he dies.
Right.
And then Tolman spills his guts. And at that point, there's too much there that they don't record, right? That they're like, oh crap, if this gets out, we got some serious problems.
Right. So on this note, also, May 1st, 1912, on the heels of all this information, our boy, Joseph E. Robinson, writes in his diary, quote, "He could not talk at all to Francis M. Lyman, president of the 12, who had been especially active in hunting down certain cases of new polygamy, but that he and Joseph F. Smith and President Lund understood one another."
Read that one more time for me. I want to make sure I got that.
Joseph E. Robinson writes, quote, "He could not talk at all to Francis M. Lyman, president of the Quorum of the 12, who had been especially active in hunting down certain cases of new polygamy, etc., but that he, Joseph F. Smith, and President Lund understood one another."
So I'm gonna see if I understand this correctly. Forgive me, I'm slow. Is he saying that Joseph F. Smith couldn't talk to Lyman?
Yes.
But that first counselor Lund and Joseph F. Smith understood each other.
Yep, correct. In conjunction with Robinson. Yes.
Dude,
they had a mutual understanding.
Oh, holy cow. Ugh.
And like I pointed out a million times already, Robinson went to Cowley to get the 1886 revelation, which they got from John W. Taylor's brother-in-law.
Yeah.
Robinson told 8 members of the Quorum of the 12 that John Taylor died for this principle and that authority has been given that's never been revoked. He's helping Roger Clausen live with his plural wife in hotel rooms in California.
Right.
He's doing all the legwork.
Yep. Oh man, this just, well, and the other thing I think it does show, I think it does cement that at this point, the office of the first presidency of the church and the Quorum of the 12, under the direction of Francis Lyman, are completely at odds.
Yep.
They're essentially functioning as two separate governing bodies with different agendas.
That's what it seems like. I don't know what John Winder is the other counselor in the first presidency at this point. I know he was involved with legal what I don't believe he performed any plural sealings, but if I remember correctly, what he did do was he officiated as a justice of the peace for people who were in a plural situation that once the first wife died, he married
Okay.
the second wife legally to her husband.
Gotcha.
He did one or two of those. But in addition, in relation to what we just read about Joseph Robinson, this is interesting, which supports your comments. Quinn says that in relation to this, beginning in October of 1904, First Counselor Anthony H. Lund had acted as a go-between for letters to Apostle Rudger Clausen in care of the presidency's office from the plural wife Clausen married 4 months after the Second Manifesto. Post-Manifesto polygamist Joseph E. Robinson was not released as a mission president until after Joseph F. Smith died, despite Apostle Francis M. Lyman repeatedly asking Smith to drop him.
Ooh. The fallout from this is massive.
Yeah.
Right? We are getting now a look inside of leadership on both fronts, the first presidency as well as the Quorum of the 12, that is absolutely breathtaking in scope, because what we find is not what's purported, that there's always unity, that the first presidency is marching orders and the 12 carries it out.
Oh no. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I mean that's the image that's portrayed. But yeah, no, no way. I don't even think today. No way.
How much longer does Joseph F. Smith live after the excommunication of John W. Taylor?
7 years.
Okay.
On March 21st, 1913, local 70s Quorum secretary and Salt Lake Temple Square missionary Nathan G. Clark marries his second wife, Cleo Afton Call, in the Salt Lake Temple by John W. Woolley.
Ooh, so Woolley doesn't kind of really go on the down low a whole bunch, right? I mean, he's sealing a second wife inside the Salt Lake Temple.
Yeah, and he was a temple worker at this point, set apart as a temple worker, I believe, and so he had access to do that, I guess. Another connection to John W. Taylor with this, though, is not only did Nathan Clark try to not only was Nathan Clark neighbors to John W. Taylor in Farmington, not only did he express interest in courting John W. Taylor's daughter Alta, not only did he personally help John W. Taylor move his families to Provo and establish their homesteads down there after John W. Taylor was removed from the Quorum of the 12, his second wife is Cleo Afton Call, who is the daughter of Anson B. Call from Mexico, who had that vision, if you remember, where John W. Taylor was revealed to him to be the keeper of that book of life.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. I'd forgot about that.
And so Nathan Clark marries Anson B. Call's daughter, Cleo, um, which I just blew my mind when I found that out.
Yeah,
That just shows me that John W. Taylor was pulling those strings still with his relationship with not
absolutely.
just Clark, but with also with his close relationship with Anson B. Call, who he helped enter into the principle in Mexico.
Yeah. Oh, man. So what
Which
did, go
that's
ahead.
like this is like the retroactive evidence I have for why I really think Nathan Clark's recommendations to Tolman were
Or
Taylor's.
John W. Taylor's.
Yeah,
Yeah,
all those things.
man. So
What was your question?
what's happening with Taylor after this, after he's been excommunicated?
Uh, Tradition states that he's recommending people to John Woolley to get married, which that stands to reason with what we just read.
Yep.
But ultimately, he had some businesses. His family was involved with some like I don't know, they're farming fruit and produce kind of stuff, farmers market type stuff, I guess. They made quite a bit of, I think they made fairly decent doing that. It was a whole family enterprise with all the different plural families he had down there. He had adjoining farms um, that he got for his wives.
And then what about, do we have any record how he was received by others in the community, other Mormons? Did it have a chilling effect on his standing in the community? Did people still, because as we discussed about Joseph Musser, even after his excommunication, he's still invited to sit on the stand in like
Right.
conferences, right?
No, there's nothing I've seen um, that insinuates he had anything that was really tarnished in the eyes of the general membership. The
Okay.
people viewed him as a hero. In fact, he told them in the Quorum of the 12 that I rarely go to church because when I go there, I'm asked to speak, and stuff like that.
Okay. All right. So he's kind of almost a folk hero at this point.
Yeah, living folk hero. Um, on the heels of this, we're getting into 1914, January 23rd. Um, Something I haven't heard talked about hardly, I mean, actually, I don't even think ever until I did research on this for myself. But 1914, Matthias Cowley gets drugged back into a trial
Okay.
for a second time. And
But
there's several.
he's already been exed, right?
He never got excommunicated. He
Okay.
was he was disfellowshipped and I think forbidden from taking the sacrament and exercising priesthood.
Okay. All right. Okay. So he gets drugged back in?
Yeah, he gets drugged back in 1914 because Francis Lyman thinks that he's still helping people enter into the principle.
Lyman is relentless.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
So I was wrong. Let me amend. John Woolley was not excommunicated in October of 1914. He was excommunicated March 30th, 1914.
Okay.
Well, this is the point we're getting to. Um, Heber J. Grant writes in his diary, "My office till 10, then meeting at the Bishop's Building, the cases of John W. Woolley and Matthias Cowley considered." So these things are going on in conjunction with each other. 10 of the 12, Joseph H. Grant and George J. Cannon present. After lunch, only members of our council were present. All spoke, and it was voted to cut Brother Woolley off the church. Concluded that we needed a little bit more evidence in Brother Matthias Cowley's case. So he gets put on the hot seat again, and they start asking him questions about how he's involved with John W. Woolley's plural marriages.
Right.
But they can't find enough evidence to excommunicate him.
Okay.
And so I might read a bit of those off my phone. Let's see. On January 16th, 1914, John Woolley signs an affidavit which states, at Centerville, Davis County, Utah, on the 16th day of January, 1914, President Francis M. Lyman and Anthony W. Ivins called at my home, and in answer to question asked, I made the following statement. Some months ago, I met Matthias F. Cowley on the street, and he asked me if I was familiar with the sealing ceremony. I told him I was. He said, if any good man come to you, don't turn them down. I believed from that statement that it was still proper that plural marriages be solemnized and that President Joseph F. Smith had authorized Cowley to instruct me. Since that time, I have married wives to Nathan G. Clark, Joseph A. Silver, Reuben G. Miller, Peter Kimball Lemon Sr., and the ceremony in the case of Miller was performed at the southeast part of Salt Lake, the woman being a widow whose name I don't know. The Lemon ceremony was in Centerville. The name of the woman, I think, being Johnson, signed John Woolley, Francis Lyman, and witness Anthony W. Ivins. A few days later, in Matthias Cowley's trial, Matthias Cowley says, Brother John Woolley said to me that he thought it was all right and related to me how President John Taylor had spent the whole night at his place, and the president he had said in the morning that the principle would not be done away with, and I told Brother Woolley that I could have nothing to do with it. President Francis M. Lyman said, Brother Judson Tolman also claimed that you sent men to him. Cowley says, this I never did. I never sent a man to Brother Tolman. Matthias Cowley says, in answer to Brother Heber J. Grant, I deny that I ever asked Brother Woolley if he was familiar with the sealing ordinance or that I told him not to turn a good man down if he came to him. Brother Reuben G. Miller explained that Brother Woolley had told him how the abolishing of plural marriage was being agitated by the legal advisors of the church, and how President Taylor had spent the entire night in pondering over the question, and in the morning came into the room where Brother Woolley was with his face illuminated and said this principle was not to be done away with, but to remain on the earth, and this had strengthened Brother Woolley in believing that the practice should be maintained, and also had influenced Brother Miller. So we have some really strong evidence, not from Lauren Woolley, but from John Woolley about the 1886 events right there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's pretty consistent with the account that was given before.
Yeah, and so these are official minutes of the Quorum of the 12 that I was reading from.
Official, the official minutes?
The official minutes. So I don't know what the unofficial minutes say, but that's the...
Wow. Holy cow.
Was it yeah, that's minutes. That was the minutes. In February of 1914, this is Anthony Ivins' diary. He writes that Brother Francis, or he says, John Woolley stated to Brother Francis M. Lyman and me that Brother Matthias F. Cowley did say to him in conversation which took place on southeast corner of the temple block that if any good man comes to you, don't turn him down. That was the only thing Cowley said to him on the subject. He would not have assumed to solemnize a marriage had it not been for that remark. He thought President Joseph F. Smith had authorized Cowley to speak. Could not remember just when this conversation took place, but it was before he solemnized marriages. So we have a case of either John W. Woolley has been approached by both John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley, or John Woolley is avoiding the truth and giving a calculated answer to shoulder the burden on Matthias Cowley, who's already been dealt with. Yeah.
And protect Joseph F. Smith, I'm guessing.
And protect Joseph F. Smith. Yep.
And see, I have nothing to back this up, right? But I can only imagine that these guys know that that Francis Lyman's gunning for Joseph F. Smith, and they understand the stakes are high,
Mm-hmm.
and that they are going to protect it at all costs for the sake of the church, right? Understanding now that post-manifesto polygamy has come to an end in the LDS Church. Let's try to preserve what's left.
Do you know
And
what the irony about Francis M. Lyman's crusade against polygamy is?
what's that?
Do you know what the irony of Francis Lyman's crusade is?
What's that?
His son, Richard R. Lyman, when he was made a member of the Quorum of the Twelve, entered into a polygamous marriage by
Holy,
solemn covenant in 1925.
holy cow.
He was the last apostle who's ever been excommunicated from the church, and he was excommunicated in 1943 when
Was
the
that the
first,
guy that was like drug out in his underwear after?
oh, I don't think so.
There was an apostle, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to look this up. Give me just a second here. There was an apostle who was doing this about that time, and they had the police go and arrest him for illegal cohabitation and drug him out
Oh,
in his underwear.
yeah, that was it. That was it. Yeah,
Okay. All
they
right.
had the police.
Okay. I was working in the Salt Lake County recorder's office,
Oh no.
and someone just showed it to me. There was just an old newspaper clipping. But sure enough, dude, they perp walked him. I mean, they found out that he was living this plural marriage.
Mm-hmm.
His wife knew, his first wife.
Mm-hmm.
They sent out spies after him, right?
Yes, they
Like
did. Yes, they did. They
they
didn't believe.
they knew that he was up to something.
Yeah.
When they finally find him, and it was a widow, right,
Yeah.
that he'd actually interacted with, if I'm not mistaken, even back when he was a bishop.
Yep. Yep.
And
Yep. Yep.
and they got married, and then sure enough, the spies catch him going in there during the night, and the church calls the cops, and
Yes, they did.
they perp walk him. I mean, they absolutely perp walk this dude, and he's just humiliated.
I was reading up on this recently. The guy who led the raid was a former member of his ward when he was bishop, if I remember correctly. And he said, if I had known it was Richard Lyman, I never would have entered that house. Because the church did not tell him that it was an apostle, let alone Richard R. Lyman in there. They just said, go and deal with it or whatever. I don't even know what probable cause they gave to them, but he said, I would never have entered that house if I had known it was Richard R. Lyman.
And see, this goes back to, for good and bad, right? I want to say that there can't be good that comes out of this, but this is why I think that the founders were maybe onto something with the separation of church and state until you can have a full
Yeah,
theodemocracy, right? I mean,
sure.
because you essentially get marching orders from church headquarters, go get him, right? Whoever him is. And
Mm-hmm.
they go in there and they perp walk this guy, right? And absolutely devastate him and his entire family.
Yep.
And it was dirty. It was so dirty. When I read about this.
Well, I'm glad that you were read up on it and that you corrected me. That's good. So Richard R. Lyman also has interactions with Nathan Clark later too.
Really?
Yeah, well, at least one instance that I'm aware of.
Boy, I'll
Anyway,
bet you his old man was pissed.
oh yeah, dude, it's just it's wild, dude. You couldn't make this up. Um, so Anthony Ivins writes on his journal in March 1st, 1914. In the evening, Peter K. Lemon called at the hotel. I served notice on him to appear before the Council of the 12 and to show cause why he should not be excommunicated for unlawfully taking a wife. He stated to me that Nathan G. Clark had written him that if he wished to take a plural wife, to come to Centerville, Utah, where he, Clark, would meet him at a house 2 blocks west. He followed directions and went to the house of a young man named Woolley and told him what he come for. The young man said that there would be a man there soon to attend to the matter for him. And later, an older man came to him and performed the ceremony.
Wow.
So you got probably Lauren and John Woolley there.
Right.
This is interesting too. In that conversation with Anthony W. Ivins, Peter K. Lemon says he had never talked with Brother Matthias F. Cowley on this subject. He said that he would appear before the council and make a full statement of facts. He had met Brother Joseph W. Musser at the Fisher home some time ago, and he told him that John Woolley had given the whole thing away.
That John Woolley had given it all away.
Yeah. But interesting that places Joseph Musser and John Woolley into association with each other as early as whenever that marriage took place, before 1914.
Right.
Before March of 1914, for sure. March 30th, 1914, from the minutes of the Quorum of the Twelve, the minutes state Brother John Woolley stated some time ago that he went up to the president's office to talk with Joseph F. Smith as he was intending to take a trip to the Sandwich Islands for his health. President Anthony H. Lund and James E. Talmadge were present at the time. The conversation was not very long. As he got up to go, President Smith asked him what about the Joseph Silver case, and I told him about it, and he said, "Didn't you think you were doing wrong?" I said I didn't think I was doing very wrong at the time. That's interesting. So, but James E. Talmadge was there. I will just point that out. So
Yep.
so putting on the show.
Yep. Yep. And Talmadge was a hater of polygamy, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he was definitely tasked a lot of the time with dealing with these early cases that we're talking about. I don't know if there was any personal motivation or grudges. I don't know if there was or not, or if he's just doing his duty, being a good soldier.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah.
Let's see what else I got. The minutes of April 2nd states that on Monday, the 12 sat in council on the cases of Matthias F. Cowley and John W. Woolley, but failed to bring out evidence enough to justify the council in taking action against Brother Cowley, although some things went to indicate that he was responsible for Brother John Woolley's operations. Action was taken against Brother Woolley on his own confession, and he was excommunicated from the church, but he wanted to share the responsibility of his transgression with Brother Cowley. Brother Cowley denied everything and was willing to take an oath that he had not encouraged anybody to enter plural marriage since action was taken on his case. But I will state, both guns are pointing at Cowley's involvement from Judson and Woolley, saying that he was involved. So I'm just throwing that out there.
So do you think that what's your opinion there? Do you think Cowley's just trying to preserve himself?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I do. They were all in it together at one point, and then when things began to be hunted down, there was probably some fragmentation in their,
Right.
relationships. In August of 1916, John W. Taylor was baptized by his brother Moses W. Taylor, with John M. Cannon and others present in Utah Lake. Um, Tradition states that Matthias Cowley performed the marriage, and that two stake presidents were
You
present.
mean baptism,
What did I say?
marriage?
Yes, thank you for correcting me. Yeah, fundamentalist tradition states that the rebaptism done, which was clandestine, was done by Cowley at Utah Lake with two stake presidents. I found in James E. Talmage's diary that the whole situation was done by Moses W. Taylor, who was told by John M. Cannon to rebaptize John W. Taylor. And Moses W. Taylor told James E. Talmage that when John M. Cannon had gone to, if I'm getting this right, I'd probably put it in here. Let me just make sure I'm getting this information right.
Sure.
Forgot about that. Can't find it. In any case, either John M. Cannon or Moses W. Taylor had also gone to Joseph F. Smith asking what could be done for John W. Taylor in his case. And I think it was Moses W. Taylor went to Joseph F. Smith. And Joseph F. Smith told Moses W. Taylor, you know what authority you have. And while I cannot, I can tell you that nothing can be done in the church for Brother Taylor, but then something along the lines of, I don't need to tell you what you can do for your brother, you know.
Interesting.
And so they went and performed that rebaptism, which was not accepted by the church and was not, no record was made of it. And it caused quite the scandal. In fact, there was public announcements made after John W. Taylor died regarding this, that addressing rumors, because rumors had started to circulate that John W. Taylor had been accepted back into the church before he died secretly. Although fundamentalist tradition does state also, or I shouldn't say fundamentalist, Taylor family tradition states that uh, Joseph F. Smith delivered temple garments and robes to Nettie Taylor, Woolley Taylor, to bury her husband in at the funeral, which was a closed casket, so that he could be buried in his temple robes.
Dude. Ugh. Like even in death, the poor guy can't get just some recognition. I mean, just close the casket, right? We don't want anyone seeing he's in his temple robes.
Yeah, that's tough. But on the same, on the other hand, I mean the cards show that while these things couldn't be acknowledged, it shows that I think it validates Brother Taylor, especially in the eyes
Sure
of the
it does.
president of the church.
Sure it does.
It shows his valiance. It shows the belief that Joseph F. Smith and others had that the Lord, the Lord understood John. You know what? Let's just say John W. Taylor's life and name is written on the books of the Lamb of God, and it doesn't need to be on the membership records of the church.
It again boggles my mind that Joseph F. You said it was Joseph F. Smith who delivered it.
Mm-hmm.
The president of the church personally delivers the garments and the temple robes, but yet still feels compelled to tell his wife Nettie, make sure you close that casket. It just smacks of a man who's not in control.
Yep. No, you're absolutely correct. Fundamentalist tradition states that before John W. Taylor died, that Um, the tradition states that John W. Taylor met Francis Lyman on the street shortly before his death and informed him, Francis, I am not going to be here on earth much longer, and when I go, I am going to send for you to stand before the great judge and account for the things you've done to me. And while President Lyman outwardly appeared to be in good health in that season of his life, a few weeks later, John died on October 10th, 1916, of cancer, and a month following it, President Lyman died as well on November 18th, 1916.
Ah, oh man, I wonder what that crossing over looked like.
Yeah. However, John W. Taylor has been re-added to the membership of the church, and a rebaptism was done um, by Joseph Fielding Smith, President Joseph Fielding Smith. He was not president of the church yet. It was under David O. McKay's presidency, and Apostle Joseph Fielding Smith officiated, I believe, rebaptizing Raymond Taylor, his son, as proxy for John W. Taylor, and reconferring the priesthood upon John W. Taylor. And so his name is on the records of the church now, and those things are restored.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I would dare to say they never left, right?
I would totally agree with that. That's not even kidding you.
So what do you think? Oh, go ahead.
No, you go.
No, I was going to do a wrap-up question. I thought you were done.
We're not done. We are done with John W. Taylor, but there's a few other points of post-manifesto polygamy I would like to cover.
Yeah.
For context's sake. However, I would like to read a few things that people said about John W. Taylor after he died.
Okay.
Josiah E. Hickman, who we understand was a post-manifesto polygamist. He appeared in some of these episodes. And he was accused of being part of the circle and network that we talked about. And he probably was if he was accused of being it. But in any case, he writes in his journal on October 12th, October 12th, 1916, 2 days after John W. Taylor dies, he writes, John W. Taylor, former apostle, died Tuesday. His death caused a profound sorrow in my heart. I have loved him for his integrity and the great prophetic power he has once possessed. He was true to his convictions, life or death. He has been excommunicated from the church, yet he was firm in his belief and still held that our leaders sacrificed principle for policy. He felt the manifesto was a snare and a delusion, and he could never accept of it, but held to God's revelation to his Father. I have this revelation in my possession, and in it God especially says that he does not wish this people to sacrifice the principle of plural marriage or make further promises to their enemies. He was true to his belief and testified to his death to the truthfulness of the gospel and a great undying faith that all would be righted in time. His death was due to a cancerous condition of his intestines. He left 5 wives, it was really 6, and between 20 and 30 children. Apostle Lyman once told me some 20 years ago, Apostle Lyman once told me some 20 years ago that John W. Taylor was the most spiritually minded man of the quorum. He said, quote, he is our prophet.
Wow.
So at one point, Francis M. Lyman was calling John W. Taylor our prophet, meaning the nickname that he had, which was the prophet of the quorum.
Yeah.
Isn't that a sad tale of betrayal? Oof.
Where did Lyman go wrong?
It was that Reed Smoot hearings, dude. I'm convinced of it. It was the public shame.
Stupid. Stupid. That's what I keep coming back to. Just dumb. I mean, you're worried about public perception.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I don't know why. Was it more than that? Was it entangled with more of a fear of the fallout of the temporal well-being of the rest of the members of the church, or the idea that maybe people's salvation would be at stake because if the church fractured, the general membership who were too weak in their faith would not have a rod to cling to. Maybe that's the case. And I know at least AUB rhetoric is that the church is doing a mission of a terrestrial order still, allowing the gospel as taught in the Book of Mormon to be promulgated and to bring people into a higher degree of glory than they would have, even though they've abandoned plural marriage, which will exalt you, right? And that you need to go to the priesthood group to get that done. I don't know if it was that kind of forethought at this early time period that justified these things. That's probably the best motivation that there could have been. And I hope it wasn't anything less than besides personal, ownership of material things or prosperity.
Yeah. I don't know. Lyman seems awfully snaky, though.
I can't say he wasn't a good man in most junctures of his life, but yes, I would agree. By the end of his life, he was acting like a snake. And he was very vindictive. And Joseph Musser tells us that from his interview as well. Down the line, in a reminiscence told by Price Johnson in 1971, there's an interview done by Rhea Allred Coons on Price Johnson. Rhea Allred Coons asks, "Do you know when Nathan Clark received his authority?" Price Johnson says, "Yes, he told me the whole story. He was called with Joseph Musser to be a missionary on the Temple Block. John W. Woolley and Joseph F. Smith later laid their hands on him and ordained him to perform plural marriages. This was at the same time that they ordained Joseph Musser. Nathan told me that story. I've discussed it with him many times." Rhea Coons asked, "Do you know when this authority was given?" Price Johnson says, "Let's see here. There was about 7 years, and he told me in 1923, 7 years. So that puts 7 years before 1923 fits well with Joseph Musser saying that he received his keys of Elijah in 1915.
Right.
Oh, now I found Talmage's diary about the baptism. But I think we all went over that, so we don't need to rehash that. In 1921, March 15th, Heber J. Grant writes in his journal that President Frank Y. Taylor and his counselor called and explained the status of Joseph Musser, of the Joseph Musser case, and Brother Penrose and I assured them that while we felt their evidence would not be accepted in a court of law, it was sufficient, in addition to the inspiration of the Spirit of the Lord, to excommunicate Musser from the church. So that's when Joseph Musser gets excommunicated from the church. He was attempting to take a fourth wife. We know that around March or May of 1922, a year later than that, Lauren Woolley is actively relating and proselyting the 1886 events at the Nathaniel Baldwin radio plant. Also, at the same time that Joseph Musser is being excommunicated, they also excommunicated Patriarch Israel Barlow Jr. for helping people enter into plural marriage in 1921. So they excommunicated his son in 1910, and they excommunicated him in 1921.
So they're just going, they're still cleaning this up, right?
They're still cleaning this up, and these are just all the people that were involved with those early days before the fundamentalist movement came out, right? And we're really getting to the point where it really is emerging now. I just wanted to bring this up so there's more full context. Let's see. In Richard R. Lyman's diary, quoted in the minutes of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, the electronic edition, Richard Lyman writes, on March 27th, 1921, Nathan G. Clark says he was advised by President Joseph F. Smith to make himself a sacrifice, and he is telling that it is all right for men to take plural wives if they will do it quietly. The church will sanction it. So that might have been the influence for Richard Lyman to enter into his union.
Absolutely it was. Absolutely it was, without a doubt, right? He's thinking to himself, okay, how do I do this? Well, everyone knows who Nathan G. Clark is. Let's go talk to him.
Sure.
And then it's game on, right? The solemn covenant is made.
Sure. Keep it quiet in the church, like Nathan Clark is saying. In Heber J. Grant's diary, Heber writes on April 29th, 1931, this morning, a man by the name of Muir called, and I had a long talk with him. He manifested a very fine spirit. He explained that Brother Matthias F. Cowley had tried to convert him to plural marriage in 1910 after he had been dropped from the Council of the 12 and had pledged himself that if we would not cut him off the church, he would stop teaching that it was right to practice plural marriage. So that's an additional witness that Cowley was involved with all that, despite his despite his protests and denials. In 1933, Heber J. Grant writes in his journal that Joseph Fielding Smith called and expressed his regret at the speeches of Bishop Archie Graham, telling of his, let's paraphrase. Archie Graham was telling of an event where he kind of had some astral projection stuff going on, like where you could see the spirit world or something. In any case, it was really popular, and he was going around giving these lectures. And Joseph Fielding Smith, because President Smith's dead at this point, Joseph Fielding Smith is talking to Heber J. Grant, saying that this shouldn't really be going on. And so Heber J. Grant calls Bishop Archie Graham in and has a talk with him. The journal entry says, quote, I explained about the manifestations and the private meetings of the patriarchs in Davis County with Brother John W. Taylor, and how they thought they were more spiritually minded than others, and that these identical patriarchs got off their hooks and performed illegal plural marriages, etc.
Wow. So this leaves a mark on the men who really tried to stamp this out, right?
Yeah.
And boy, in some ways, I think this is probably the birth of correlation.
Oh yeah,
LDS Church,
no doubt.
right? They're like, we can't leave these people just to read their scriptures and actually do what they say.
Yeah. All right. Maybe we should close this with the words of Joseph Musser. How about that?
Okay.
In Truth Magazine, Volume 6, Joseph Musser writes a little editorial recalling John W. Taylor. In it, Musser writes, during his mortal career, he was, perhaps, the leader among the brethren of his quorum in the prophetic gifts. He was designated the prophet of the quorum by Heber J. Grant in a letter from England to President Joseph F. Smith. John W. Taylor was a true apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. He lived for the gospel. His devotion to the kingdom of God was paramount. He entertained no thoughts nor ambitions countering his loyalty to God. Wherever his lot was cast, he defended the truth. In his missionary work, he was a living prototype of Paul the Apostle. With him, truth was life, his very existence. He could no more be wrong to his conceptions of right than he could change the law of gravity. He was a true son of a noble sire, and in this life, the light and lives of all the prophets of God were reflected. With him, there were no classes among true Latter day Saints. He followed the example of his worthy father, the prophet John Taylor. When reference was made before the latter to the common people of the church, he replied with emphasis, quote, "There are no common people among true Latter day Saints. All are on the same footing. All are of a royal class." Apostle Taylor heeded the same truth he saw among the humblest of the saints, the princes and princesses of heaven, while many arrogant and affluent types he marked as failures.
Hmm. Okay. I'm going to ask you a couple of quick questions.
Yeah, let's recap. Sure, no doubt.
And then I have something just occurred to me that I want to run by you.
Sure.
First, what are the repercussions to fundamentalists for the work that John W. Taylor did?
That's a great question. I honestly don't know if things would have turned out the way they did with the priesthood work, barring divine intervention, if he had not been involved. Without his example and public and private encouragement of polygamy, all the years of his life, despite the manifestos, I don't know, and it's maybe they would have, but would men like John Woolley have had the strength to carry on
Right.
that burden alone? But when
Right.
you have such a freaking monolith to look up to, you don't want to let them down. And
No,
you're encouraged to shoulder that burden and carry on the work when they're gone.
absolutely.
I could not tell you. I mean, if there were three pillars to Mormon fundamentalism, I would probably say, and this may be subject to reflection of, if I wasn't so tired at this point in time, but if I were to say the three pillars, they were probably John W. Taylor, John Woolley, and Lauren Woolley. No, and Joseph Musser. Sorry, John Woolley, John W. Taylor, and Joseph Musser. Not to discount Lauren Woolley, not to
Sure.
discount others, but those three people, without their willingness and just the circumstances they were placed in, with the things that they did, not that someone else couldn't have done them, but they did them. They did those things that allowed the work to carry on. I just, like I said, someone else could have been raised up to do it. Obviously, there was authority being compartmentalized and spread around, but I really think any way you trace it, even especially if you don't believe in the Lauren Woolley story, which the church has tried to malign, and I'm not saying I don't believe in it because I do, but this whole situation brings an interesting redundancy or fail-safe program to the keys being passed on.
Whether you want to claim it coming from the LDS Church or outside from the Woolies, there's
Right.
there's a line to trace.
There's a line to trace it to another apostle of the Lord, which has been underrated, which is John W. Taylor. Yeah, his apostleship is just as good as any other apostleship, in my opinion.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. I look at it as you have, in my opinion, two lines of authority that you could really, in this case, speaking of this case, there's two lines of authority that you can cling to. You can cling to the Woolies, right? If you think the church lost everything in 1886.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could say, nope, the church still had it, and there's an apostle that branches off, so to speak, and keeps it alive. So I agree with you, a fail-safe.
Yep.
Let me ask you this question. What do you think the legacy of John W. Taylor is within the LDS Church?
Oh, I know. Growing up, I never heard about him. The first time I ever heard about him was when I was on my mission and the church published what they called gospel topics essays, and they addressed polygamy after the manifesto, and they literally just placed it just on Matthias Cowley and John W. Taylor and said it was nothing more than just a few plural marriages. As we have discussed, nothing could be further from the truth.
Right. I think John W. Taylor is really probably kind of responsible for the church doing a couple of things. One is this big push for correlation, right? Where we're going to be the same everywhere across the board because we can't have a rogue element again, like we just saw.
Sure.
And I also think that John W. Taylor, and I'm not saying that these are bad things that Taylor did, not by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just saying this is what his opponents did because of it, because of his actions of holding to the truth and erring on the side of right. So correlation. The other thing I think that John W. Taylor forces the church to do, and maybe that's a better way of putting it, right? I think John Taylor forces the church to go to a correlation model because you can't have rogue elements, so to speak, just picking up the scriptures and being like, well, that's what it says. Let's do that. The other thing I think he does is he forces the church to start instituting loyalty tests to the man in charge. Right. And I think he forces them to change from a place, and this may upset some people, and I apologize. This is just how I see it. It forces the church to move from a church founded in principle to a church of men. Right? Doesn't matter what the guy before you did. It only matters what the guy right now does.
Oh my, yes.
And I think that's a direct result of Taylor's doggedness and determination to serve the Lord at any cost, even if it flies in the face of what is said publicly.
I want to know, I'm making my own comment to our listeners on that, something you brought up about following the living prophet or following the living oracles. And the rhetoric is that those are the dead prophets. Follow the living prophet, right? I will state to you right now, just because they're dead doesn't mean they're wrong.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. And look, let's parse out some words here, right? I mean, the other side likes to do that.
Sure.
Those past prophets, they're not dead. They're just on the other side of the veil.
Right. Or your living prophet's just going to be a dead prophet one day. So then why even listen to his words now?
Absolutely.
You just chuck it in the trash bin.
Now,
because nothing's permanent.
Yep. The other thing I will say is that after John W. Taylor and his generation, I know there was one in there at the same time he was that went through, but I can't think of too many Youngs or Taylors being called to the Quorum of the 12 after this.
Sure. No, you're right. You're right about that.
I think, this is my opinion, I think he scared the crap out of the organization. And they were like, if we want to move forward, if we want to, quote, progress, we cannot be having these families be in leadership any longer.
That's a good point.
And because after this, I know there's a Young on there at that point, but after him, I don't see anybody else.
There might have been one more Young. There might have been a Dilworth Young, I want to say, but
okay, you might be right, but
I don't know.
Certainly don't see any more Taylors.
Not that I recall.
You don't see any more Woodruffs.
Nope.
And we'll just say, okay, there was one more Young after that.
Maybe.
But since then, no. I think John W. Taylor single-handedly scared the crap out of the church and the church said, we can't have you know,
The
the
blood legacy of these people.
the posterity of these early leaders throw monkey wrenches into what we want to do from this point forward.
That's potentially a very fair observation.
The other thing I'll say is that we would not have what we have now today as fundamentalists without John W. Taylor. It just
I
doesn't
agree.
happen.
I agree. It
Doesn't
would have,
work.
best case scenario, it would have happened some other way.
Right.
But like I've stated before, he laid in a similitude to Christ as a true prophet of God should be. And his life was that way in ways that are way beyond his circumstances and control. He was willing to lay down his life for the perpetuation of the priesthood. It's
Absolutely.
that we can be exalted.
Yep. Yep. 100%. 100%. And he's indispensable for his time, as
Yep.
much as Brigham Young was indispensable for his time.
Amen.
John W. Taylor was the indispensable man for his time. And I'm sure it must have hurt his children somewhat to have to see their dad pass away in the circumstances that he did. But a funny thing is that because of God and because of honest history, the truth always comes out. The truth always comes out. And I would dare to say that in going forward, we'll look at guys like Taylor and Musser and Woolley a lot more frequently than what we have up to this point. Because quite frankly, I think we're going to need their examples more and more.
Sure.
And I think that's really the legacy. Come what may, come hell or high water, just stand for what you know is right and let the consequences fall. Consequences be damned. So,
Preach it. That's right.
dude, I'll tell you what, this was good stuff. I always enjoy it every single time. So, anything you
Now
want
you're
to
all,
add?
no, I don't know. I'm too tired to think of much besides saying you're all caught up for now.
Yeah,
That's all I got, I think.
awesome. Awesome. All right, man. Well, I guess I'll see you in a few days now.
Sounds great. Can't wait.
Awesome. Bye, everybody.